You're most welcome to this meeting of the Potential of Microcredentials in Southern Africa project, PoMiSA. Welcome to the colleagues in the auditorium, quite good representation. And then we've got very good representation online as well. If you have any questions, so let me just go through let me introduce myself first. My name is Britta Zavada. I see on the program it doesn't have an affiliation. That's because I'm a bit confused, and the CHE might also be a bit confused because I did retire in December, but I'm still doing quite a bit of work for the CHE. So it's my honor and privilege to still be part of the PoMiSA project and to facilitate this session for you. Can I just get an indication from the online people that everybody can hear? Just a thumbs up, perhaps?
At least on my end, I can hear good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for that. So there are quite a number of people in the auditorium, and I see we are now at 48 online as well, with most of the speakers being online. The PoMiSA project is, PoMiSA is short for the potential. Yes, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, to do some magic here. It's spotlighting there, TK, but not, yeah, okay. Okay, so that's who I am, Britta, and I'll be facilitating the session. The question and answer session will be facilitated by Dr. James Kiwi a bit later on. Just some house rules for the colleagues in the room. Please make sure that you sign the register. And for the colleagues online, can we please ask that you sign the register by dropping your name and your affiliation, the institution and the country in the chat, please. So if you could do that for us, just to make sure that we have all of you with your exact affiliation and chat. Then we will later on, and oh yes, the people in the room, Shirley, please make sure that you all mute absolutely everything on your laptop so that we don't get a kind of echo. So just a brief introduction. The PoMiSA project represents a collaborative endeavor of 7 countries, so mostly Southern Africa and in Europe, with 17 institutions. South African and European universities, national councils, and other strategic partners, the project aims at exploring and leveraging the transformative potential of microcredentials within the SADC region. The project is funded by the EU and consists of various work packages, and I won't go into all of them. But the one that is already completed is the one that speaks to the state of play in each one of those 7 countries. And so the 7 country reports, as well as a synthesis report, is already available on the PoMiSA website. So we're really encouraging you to go and have a look at the website at exactly the details of the project, as well as some of the resources that have already come out of the project. But for today, we're focusing on work package 3 within PoMiSA, which revolves around discovering what regional frameworks, policies, strategies, and plans there are globally that can inform how SADC as a region should then take microcredentials forward. Work Package 3 is led by the Council on Higher Education in South Africa in collaboration with a number of partners across the region. So in preparation for today, 2 working papers have already been prepared on the topic of regional frameworks. The first one is a desktop analysis of what resources we could find on the internet. And the second one then is was a research study with interviews of knowledgeable people, participants around regional frameworks for microcredentials. And I just want to here acknowledge my colleague, Ms. Wendy Klampi, who did that research, and she's also our scribe for today. Thank you, Wendy. Those working papers will be made available after the session in the next few weeks. I also just want to acknowledge the sort of technical team that's helping us, Ntokozo Mbengu, who, as well as Collins Baloy, who really were the ones who making sure that everything runs smoothly. So then, without taking too much time, I would like to go into the program and would like to ask Dr. Whitfield Green, the Chief Executive Officer of the CHE in South Africa, to do the formal welcome and purpose for this event. Whitty?
Thanks very much, Britta. As Britta has indicated, my name is Whitty Green from the Council on Higher Education South Africa. A really warm welcome to all the participants in this interregional consultative forum, delegates and panelists, and including those participating physically or virtually. As Britta indicated, this forum is convened as part of a collaborative project that is exploring the potential of micro-credentials in Southern Africa, the PoMiSA project. The project involves participation from universities, qualification authorities, education organizations, and quality councils from 7 countries across the globe in alphabetical order: Belgium, Flanders, Estonia, Lesotho, Ireland, Mauritius, Namibia, and South Africa. And we welcome our delegates from all of those organizations and countries. The PoMiSA project is supported by a grant through the European Union's Erasmus Plus Capacity Building in Higher Education program. And the support of the European Union and the Capacity Building in Higher Education program is gratefully acknowledged. Microcredentials can serve multiple purposes: personal, social, and economic, and are seen as important vehicles that, in the context of a great need for responsive, flexible, and agile learning pathways, and in the context of lifelong and life-wide learning needs, microcredentials can provide complementary learning opportunities to those currently available. And importantly, for audiences and potential students that struggle to access traditional pathways. Their potential to enhance access to the workplace is strongly recognized. These are important considerations in a region where access to learning opportunities are limited and where a significant unemployment problem exists. The broad goal of the PoMiSA project is to develop an enabling microcredentials framework for the Southern African region that is aligned with other frameworks across the globe, those emerging on the continent and in other regions. It is in this context that this interregional consultative forum has been convened to learn from and engage with developments across the world, obviously in a critical manner, so that we can synthesize an approach for the region that suits our regional context. Some research that we have undertaken in the project thus far as a lead up to this forum has assisted us to identify a range of questions that we will need to address as a framework starts to emerge. And we have designed this engagement to enable us to interact with those questions. We therefore look forward to the inputs from the expert panel convened here today and to engaging with the ideas that they present, which I'm sure will advance our own thinking and take us forward as we work to develop an approach to micro-credentials that will work for the region and for countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. It gives me great pleasure then to start with the introduction of the panel members. And I'll go through them. They are in the program and you will be able to see them, but I'll go through them one by one and then we'll take the presentations one after the other. So our first panel member is Colleen Jafta, who's an independent expert and brings experience from previous roles at SAQA and UCT. She consults as an expert to support implementation of the African Continental Qualifications Framework and works with various authorities and countries in Africa, providing technical contributions to national qualification frameworks, but also then specifically in the SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and in Africa. In this capacity, she designed, researched, and drafted several texts covering topics related to the thematic domains of NQFs and the African Continental Qualification Framework, also for SADC countries, and making comparisons between regional qualification frameworks. Her portfolio includes the drafting of handbooks and training modules on learning-related topics and presenting to and training various African stakeholders on various platforms. So that's our first panelist, Colleen Jafta. Then our second panelist is Dr. Nicholas Patrizzi. Nicholas is currently serving as the Director of Strategy and Development at Obrial. His role involves overseeing political functions and guiding the organization's strategy, growth, and policy development. He also works on coordinating internal teams. Nicholas provides hand-on supervision across all organizational aspects, serving as a senior expert in higher education policy for specific projects. He plays a crucial role in project execution and budget planning. Over the past 17 years, Nicholas' role has adapted alongside the organization, that's Obrial's, growth. Starting in a smaller but ambitious setting, he handled diverse responsibility during those years. Originally from Argentina, Nicholas has been living, working, and studying in Europe for 2 decades. He studied in Spain, the Netherlands, and France, and holds a PhD in classical philosophy. With him from Obrial is Marina Laria, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing any names here. Marina supports the policy development of Obrial, looking specifically at the interregional aspects of higher education and link them to development. She more specifically manages projects and initiatives of Obrial in Africa and Latin America, linking them to Obrial's general interregional strategy. Before joining Obrial, Marina acted first as the coordinator of the internationalization program of the Ministry of Education of Argentina, and then as the National Director of International Relations of the Argentina Ministry of Education, from where he presented Argentina in multilateral organizations such as the IMF, UNESCO, Mercosur, and so on. Our third presenter is Dr. Jaco Olivier, originally from South Africa, but Jaco is an advisor currently for higher education at the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver, Canada, and is also an adjunct professor of the open education at the University of Nova Gorica in Slovenia. At the Commonwealth of Learning, he's leading a project called the Developing a Commonwealth Credit Transfer Framework for Microcredentials, and he's also part of the Microcredentials and Digital Identity Wallets project of the Commonwealth of Learning, the Center for Connected Learning Foundation in Malta. He was previously a professor at the Northwest University in South Africa, where he was also the first UNESCO chair on multimodal learning and open educational resources. He's a rated and as an established researcher by the National Research Foundation in South Africa, and his research and advocacy work relates to microcredentials, open and distance learning, self-directed learning, open educational resources, and multilingualism in education. The fourth set of panelists is Mr. Koen Nomden, who's currently the team leader for transparency and recognition of skills and qualifications within the Unit on Skills and Qualifications of the European Commission. Before that, he was a policy officer in charge of the validation of non-formal and informal learning and career guidance within that unit. Other positions he held within the European Commission were that of the Erasmus Mundus Program Manager and as policy officer in charge of setting up a European executive agency in charge of implementing programs in education, training, culture, and media. Before joining the European Commission in 2003, Koen worked at the University of Antwerp as a researcher and at the European Institute of Public Administration in Maastricht. Koen studied public policy and public administration at the University of Twente and holds a master's in European Studies from the College of Europe. With him is Isabel Ladron Arroyo. Isabel works as a policy officer in the Director General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission, covering specifically microcredentials and inclusion in vocational education and training. As part of the Junior Professionals Program, she also has experience in the Commission, working in the Director General for Research and Innovation, for Energy, and in the Legal Service. She studied an Erasmus Mundus Masters in Global Studies and writing her master's thesis on youth inequalities in the EU. She has worked as a social innovation project manager in the field of youth and social inclusion, first in an NGO and later as a consultant, focusing on sustainability and social impact. She also worked for 6 months in Nicaragua, coordinating a project related to feminism and gender studies. Her background is in journalism and film, TV, and media studies, but with a minor in economics. So that is the fourth set of presentations that we'll be getting. And then the fifth and final set in the presentations is from Dr. Borene Chakroon, who has worked as a trainer, chief trainer, project manager, and consultant for organizations such as the European Union and the World Bank before joining the European Training Foundation in 2001, where he was the senior human capital development specialist. He's now Director of Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems Division at UNESCO headquarters, where much of his recent work has focused on global trends in reforming education and training systems and on developing the global agenda for skills development in the context of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. He's also the coordinator of the Global Education Coalition, launched by UNESCO to respond to the COVID pandemic crisis. He has authored and co-authored various articles and books in the field of skills development and lifelong learning. So as you will see, colleagues, we have a very powerful panel and we really look forward to hearing from you. And so the way the program is set up, first of all, we will have a short presentation from each one of those panelists or set of panelists. And then after that, we will go into a conversation where Dr. James Kiwi will lead the panelists in a conversation. So may I request our first panelist, Colleen Jafta, to come to the front, and then can somebody just help her put a presentation up, or does she know? Do you know how to do? No, she doesn't. Can you just come and help Colleen to get her presentation? I think there. See. Can you see?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I am really very excited to be part of this initiative. And I've studied a lot of the documents and I've looked at a lot of articles on microcredentials I think that this is the best way for me to bring about, what I think what is going on in SADC. So because there's no policy on microcredentials.
It's very important.
We've been there. Now they want me to attend the PoMiSA meeting.
Please mute, can you please mute this participant?
Yeah.
Okay. So because there's no policy on SADC, this is the kind of emerging position, emerging approach. So if you don't know who SADC is, we are 16 countries, we speak 3 languages, and there are kind of 5 qualifications frameworks or regional qualifications frameworks that exist in SADC. And I think that's very important information because the majority of SADC countries have NQFs, majority have 10-level NQFs. And when I say they have NQFs, it can be at different levels. It can be maybe they're in consultation, maybe they are advanced in the NQF and they've reviewed it and so on. So I'm also using that lens in this micro-credential presentation. So this micro-credential concept is not new to SADC. And my opinion is the only novelty is the word. So when people heard the word micro-credentials, I heard some people actually saying, no, what, we don't have micro-credentials. So I'm saying that in SADC we've been implementing this for years in different ways for various purposes. So whether or not we had the word or not, these things were happening. Now we've actually found a way to speak about it with a unified voice. So there is a lot of misinformation, a lack of understanding, because I've seen some surveys asking, do you have unit standards? Do you have training? Do you have micro-credentials? As if these are different things. So it does bring about a certain amount of confusion. So I thought about, seeing that we're all coming together to speak about micro-credentials, what could be the purpose? If you've worked with me before, I'm very much about when we get together, what is the purpose of the engagement? What do you want to take with you when you leave? So what are the kinds of problems that we are wanting to solve, seeing that we've created this word and we're saying that let's get together and talk about it? So we've got people from really, like we've got a very robust speaker platform today. So when you're listening, listen for what are the kinds of ideas that we can take forward as a definition. What are the types of micro-credentials that, because it's not one size fits all. There's like a range of micro-credentials. And I ask this question when people ask me about it, like, do we really want to regulate every little micro-credential? Do we want to? And if we don't, how are we going to protect the public? And then listen out for policy statements. Like, if you hear that, like, I like the word national legislation takes precedence. So listen for policy statements that you think could assist for us to support the public and for us to also support the economy. So there are a range of issues, and I thought, what, it's an add to cart. What do you add to this cart? So if I look at what people are asking me, so is every little bit of training, is it a micro-credential? Do the micro-credentials refer to the training itself, or only when I want to use that training for work or study? Is it only then that it's a micro-credential? Can these micro-credentials expire? What if I've presented a micro-credential and 2 years later you discover that that was actually fraud? I've never ever done this. I made it all up. I printed my own certificate. Can you revoke that? And who's going to do it actually? Then the whole idea around proliferation and duplication of mandates. Are we going to allow someone outside of the professional body space to actually present micro-credentials in that space? And there's so many confusing definitions around what is micro. If you got a micro, then you must have a macro. If you got a macro and a micro, you must have a meso. So are you talking about a meso? Is that macro? Is that micro? So I find that those definitions doesn't take us forward. We need to actually just categorize and say this is what we have. Let us put it in these, and this is what we're going to regulate, and this is what we're not going to regulate. I don't know if I must admit this Someone waiting in the lobby? Okay. So, and the structure of micro-credentials, some people are saying it must have learning outcomes, it must show some articulation, and we're looking at it through a lens of a qualification, actually. And then this whole unclear criteria about quality assurance. I mean, if I open up my Facebook, become a certified life coach, become an internationally accredited narrative psychologist. So what of these are real and what of these are actually made up and what of these are actually going to take me forward? And then the second one there, if a university is offering, I'm just not talking short courses, if a university is offering a short course, and if my friend James Keevy is offering a short course, I'm going to go for the university because the university's name is going to be on that certificate. So what happens to those small providers? They're just getting lost in the system. So those are some of the questions that you have to field when you're talking about this. We've already talked about proliferation of providers, duplication of mandates that already exist, and then the whole thing around foreign micro-credentials, foreign providers. It could be somebody sitting around the corner in an internet cafe saying that this is an internationally accredited. And I've actually written to some of these people to ask them, when you say internationally accredited, what do you mean? Then they give me 3 different internationally accredited bodies, and I say, send me their charter. Tell me how they were established. Tell me how long they've been doing this accreditation work. Show me the list of accredited providers. Then all of a sudden, these people just disappear, and they kind of reappear on another form. They got a different name, but it's the same people. So international accreditation of micro-credentials, what does it really mean? And then the main thing is that we want to look at micro-credentials that we can trust. We want to protect the public. We want to be able to verify information. And then at the bottom there, you see I put in costing. I can't see it because there's a panel here. But if we're going to look at costing of micro-credentials, are we going to look at costing of the actual credential, me as the learner? Some of it is free, some of it costs in the thousands, 25,000. Are we going to look at that costing? When we're looking at costing, are we going to look at costing of the quality assurance, costing of developing a list of providers who are trustworthy? So costing is actually a huge part. We can have a conference just on costing. So this whole thing, so how do we approach this micro-credential? Is it about size? If we're saying micro, there must be a macro, there must be a meso. So are we talking size? So my approach in this presentation is to say, yes, I'm using this approach. I'm saying size matters. So in order to understand what is micro, we need to understand what is macro. I'm not going to go through this. We are all from the qualification space, and we know what a macro is all about. And there I'm talking about protected terms. You'll find it in policy, the word national, the word registered on the NQF, the word NQF level, credits, and then the providers that are able to provide these credentials or the macro credentials, like your full qualifications. And this is important for us to understand our macro environment so that we can understand our micro environment. So if somebody says to me, I am offering this micro credential at 20 credits at NQF level 3, I want to see what is the whole system, that 20 credits, what does it form part of? So credits is it's a protected term. I don't know how else to say it, but you'll find it in the policies. So if a university is offering, say, for instance, a qualification or a micro-credential at NQF level 3 for 30 credits, I'm going to ask that university, did you get accreditation from the QCTO or from Umalusi if it's in South Africa? Because universities cannot operate at that level. The legislation is strict. Universities offer at levels 5 to level 10 because that is their scope, higher education. So the rules are very strict in terms of macro. And when we understand the macro environment, it becomes a little bit easier to understand the micro environment. So I'm saying for this presentation, my approach is 0 to 119 credits. That's the micro ecosystem. So we can talk about Micro, MISA, what is this? It's a non-credential, but I'm just saying for this presentation, this is the approach I'm using, including 0 credits, because sometimes you can do training. There doesn't have to be a credit. So I'm saying that in the 0 to 119 credits, there's a range of things, and micro-credentials is an umbrella term for a whole lot of different things. So I'm saying that there are micro-credentials in the NQF space that follows that legislation of the macro. The legislation is not different, but there are micro-credentials there. And then I wasn't too sure about these. There are some that's partly in the NQF space, and then there's micro-credentials that's not in the NQF space. And I wasn't sure if this was one category or two, but you can figure it out afterwards. So in the NQF space, remember I said protected terms, they can use credits, NQF level, national. These providers of the micro-credentials, there's legislation around them. They are quality assured. Things can be revoked. There are records of these credentials, records of learners who have achieved these credentials. National legislation takes precedence. And I am saying this here, that the micro-credential in the NQF space, I'm saying this part qualifications, unit standards, and credit-bearing courses in VET, in TVET, in trades and occupations. Now, I understand that in the South African environment, the unit standard is being phased out. But if you look at the history of some of the part qualifications, the unit standards, some of those, it were credit-bearing courses in the beginning, which found its way onto the NQF. So we cannot say that because South Africa is doing away with unit standards, they do not want to be in that space anymore. We need to look at the history. So I'm saying that a part qualification is a micro-credential because I've looked at the definition of what is a part qualification. It is an assessed unit of learning that is registered as part of a qualification. For example, a part qualification can be a module, can be a unit standard, etc. I've taken that from the SAQA searchable database. And just to show you that we have been doing this for many, many years. And I haven't gone into lots of countries to look at, what is the extent of their micro-credential. But in the annual report of SAQA of 2021-2022, there were more than 115 million part qualification achievements. So we have been doing this work. Then in general education and training, you have your single subjects. There are some people, I think, I don't see anyone from Umalusi. But there are some there is someone from Umalusi. So your single subjects in general education and training, are they not micro-credentials? What about your higher education credits accumulated for specific modules of a whole qualification? And I'm saying higher education credits because when you register a qualification, there are modules and there are credits attached to it. And then the achievement of any of the above through recognition of prior learning. So in terms of stackability, when we talk about stackable, when someone asks me, is it stackable? I like to ask them, are you talking about micro-credentials in the NQF space? Because these are definitely stackable. Or are you talking about micro-credentials outside of the NQF space? Because, there are different ways of putting these micro-credentials together. And some of them might not be stackable. So all of a sudden, are they not a micro-credential? So, so these are things that we need to think about. But I'm saying in the NQF space, these are stackable. So what are these micro-credentials partly in the NQF space? Now, I've sat with it for a very long time. And we've been to some of the seminars on micro-credentials. We are engaged with some of the other SADC countries. And when they listen, they say, you know what, that's a unit standard that person is talking about. That person is talking about that. That sounds like something from the professional bodies. So a professional designation. And then all of the micro-credentials related to that professional designation, your bar exams, your continuing professional development. So where do they fit in? Are they macro? Are they meso? Are they micro? Are there others in this cluster? And there's a definite regulation there because these are kind of regulated by professional bodies. That is why I said it's partly in the NQF space because there's some kind of semblance of legislation. There are records. You can follow up. Some things can be revoked. There's some ways to protect the public. Then also your learnerships and your internships, where do they fall? Macro, meso, micro. Then the trades and all the micro credentials related to artisan training, there is a body that regulates those. So, so there is some kind of legislation around of that. And then, your evaluated foreign qualification. If I have a foreign qualification, it cannot be registered on the NQF, but it can be found comparable. So if I come with a qualification from a university, say for instance in Sussex, I can't claim that to say now it's comparable to something on the NQF. I can't claim that, but it is comparable. So where do these fit? That's why I say we need to understand our whole system so that we can figure out what's macro, what's meso, what's micro. And then, yeah, I think when I go to a lot of the seminars, this is what people are talking about. When they talk about micro credentials, they are focused here. So your industry employer training, and there's a whole lot. 2 months ago, I attended a micro credential seminar where they had taken a job description. So say, for instance, I am a secretary and a job opens up, say, for instance, as an evaluator. I've got no experience in evaluation, but they've taken that job description and they developed a training around it. And then they said, you know what, you can get this micro credential, then you can apply for that position. So, so there's a whole lot under reskilling and upskilling, employee development programs, and there's a lot of good training. National School of Government. If you've gone onto their website and you've done any of their training, it's quite robust, I think, and it's quite geared to specifically industry employer training, and then training for members of trade unions and labor organizations. There's a whole lot of training that happens there, bargaining skills, negotiation skills. So are these micro credentials? And if they are not, why are they not? Then the training related to qualifications. So for instance, if you're doing a psychology course, there are like certain things like COSA for psychologists, gender training, so are they micro credentials or are they not? Okay, I'm have to wrap up. So there's quite a lot of things there. I thought I'll just give you this example from the Botswana Qualifications Authority. It's from their website. They ensure the quality of these non-credit bearing short courses, and they actually provide a list of recognized short courses and a list of expired short courses, but you can go through that. And then I don't want to go through this, but these are some of the typical questions we get about this short types of learning. And yeah, that will be the end of my qualification, my presentation. And I hope that some of the reflections and what we do today will take us forward as a region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colleen, for your presentation. Many questions raised, maybe not quite answers yet, but questions raised. And thank you for the historical and the very contextual presentation that creates the kind of background for what we can be talking about. We're not going to take questions. If you have at this point, if you have questions for the panelists based on their presentation, please pop it in the chat, and then we'll see if there's time afterwards for us to go back to the questions. So the next part of our presentations is from Dr. Patrizi and Ms. Laria. Can you come and help me here so that there's the stop sharing? Okay. Thanks, Colin. Can I just check, TK? Can Dr. Patrizi?
Yes. Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Ah, good. Can you maybe just both put on your cameras so that people can see you for a moment?
Unfortunately cannot join us today, so it's going to be only me, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead with your presentation for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Actually, I was not expecting a 20 minutes presentation, but a 3 minutes intervention and a series of questions. But in any case, I will try to adapt, and I will try to be short and concrete. Let me start first by introducing Obreal and what do we do. Obreal is an association of higher education institutions and research centers based in Barcelona. We have members from Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, India, Europe, Southeast Asia, and basically we try to foster interregional cooperation in higher education as a means to promote development. In particular, we have been invited to this forum to try to speak not on behalf of what we do at Obreal in many of the projects that we are running in different parts of the world, but specifically what are we doing under the HACWA initiative. So let me very brief introduce the HACWA initiative. I say the HACWA initiative because the HACWA initiative is something that belongs basically to the European Commission and the African Union Commission, and we as Obreal are simple implementers of the initiative. We are not doing this alone, we are doing this together with the African Association of Universities, ENQA, the European Quality Assurance Network, and the AAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, together with several strategic partners, both in Africa, in all across Africa, and in Europe. HACWA, if some of you might know it, HACWA is an initiative that has been running in Africa for quite a long time. We are already in the third phase of the initiative, and basically has one general objective, which is trying to harmonize the quality assurance system, trying to harmonize higher education in Africa at the continental level through the harmonization of quality assurance procedures and standards in order to promote recognition, enhance mobility, etc. HACWA basically, the third phase that it is being implementing now, basically works on different areas with different objectives, none of them directly tackling the problem of micro-credential, but we believe that the implementation of HACWA and the discussion that HACWA promotes both politically and technically at the continental level is extremely important to, let's say, pave the way, as the previous speaker was mentioning, to a better understanding and use of micro-credentials. Micro-credentials is a topic, let me say, that it is being broadly discussed not only in Africa, but all across the world. We do believe, now speaking strictly as Obreal, that is something that somehow has been there in different forms for many years at the university landscape in different regions of the world, that still needs to structure a little bit more, but that linked to other, let's say, processes, like for discussions in the higher education sector, like for example, the modularization of courses, the discussions around credits, etc., can be a very important tool to facilitate not only access, but also a better link between higher education and economic development. Now, having said this, let me go a little bit on why HACWA can be an initiative that can serve as a good framework, both from the policy and the technical level, to, let's say, frame the discussion that you in the SADC region are having now at around the micro-credential topic. HACWA is a continental initiative. However, it is being implemented through, let's say, different projects, to put it in this way, that are looking at the different sub-regional African problems and structures. So we do work in SADC, but also we do work, for example, with the UCA and the Eastern African community. We also work with the Francophone African, etc. And it is important because, let's say, at the political level, this is something that my colleague from UNESCO probably will also mention. We do work in trying to get all the actors together discussing the problem of recognition in Africa. And we do try to promote at the policy level the buy-in of the different regions of different tools, for example, the African credit transfer system, in order to guarantee transparency of, let's say, qualifications and recognition of those qualifications. Among which we are not directly looking at micro-credentials, but clearly micro-credentials can be included in this aspect. At the technical level, SACWA is, let's say, contributing with two elements that can be of a strategic importance for the discussion of micro-credentials. The first one is basically the work that HACWA is doing in trying to promote and harmonize quality assurance standards, where in Africa there is an agency. We work with the agency in trying to adapt the standards and the quality assurance mechanisms that they implement through their institutions against the African standard and guidelines for quality assurance. And where there is not an agency, we work with a group of experts in trying to, let's say, promote the same sort of procedures. In some regions of Africa, this is more complex than in others, but we feel it's something that we are, let's say, moving in the region. When I say we, I don't say overall, I say we together with all our African partners, both at the academic level, at the quality assurance level, and at the governmental level as well. So this is one part, harmonizing quality assurance system and trying to make systems readable all across Africa. I am saying making them the same, but making the systems readable in terms of accreditation and quality standards is an important point to which HACWA, the HACWA initiative, has been contributing in Africa, in this case, in the SADC region as well, in order to offer a better ground, let's say, for the discussion around micro-credentials. On the second technical element that probably has to be mentioned here as an effort, and we are working this closely with SADC in this, that HACWA is pushing and doing in Africa, is about data collection. We have been seeing during the last couple of years and discussing this with other strategic partners of the project, UNESCO as one of them, that are dealing with data, that there are, let's say, a very scattered approach to data and some problems for data collection in different regions. The harmonization of data, or let me put it differently, the harmonization of indicators across the continent is, or the readability of indicators across the continent is something that it is complicated. So HACWA is making an effort to try to, let's say, complement the existing data collection processes in Africa by enhancing what sub-regions are doing when discussing indicators and mechanisms to collect data, including the capacity building process where the capacities are needed all across the continent. So on one hand, the contribution of HACWA to the micro-credential discussion in general across the African continent has to do with the policy discussion around harmonization of higher education, particularly through, let's say, the readability of quality standards in order to promote recognition on one hand. On the other hand, as a second technical point, the capacity building efforts for data collection that we are doing together with strategic sub-regional partners all across Africa. And there is a third element that it is, again, not directly linked to the specific discussions of micro-credential in SADC, but I feel it is important to pave the way to, let's say, or create the conditions for a better discussion of microcredential and the role of universities in this, which is all the discussion around the African credit transfer system. HACWA has been working on this for the last 5 years, taking up all the work that the previous European Commission initiatives on the topic have been doing, and basically referring to the former existing tuning approach in Africa. We have been reformulating the approach for credits and trying to look much more the problem from the recognition side and the problem that institutions have in order to, let's say, recognize credits. Once again, enhancing the capacities of both agencies and higher education institutions for this. If you put these 3 elements together, or let's say 4, the policy discussion, the enhancement of quality assurance standards, the problem of data collection and the capacity to collect data, and the discussions around credits and recognition, we feel that you have the basic elements in which the discussion of micro-credentials should be inserted. However, there is another element that probably some of the colleagues who will speak after me will mention, which is the link of, let's say, higher or educational skilling, which is something that HACWA is not directly tackling, but that it is something that it is present in every and each of the policy discussion that HACWA promotes in Africa. How to create more attractive, let's say, programs or more impactful programs linked to economic development, employability, skilling, etc., of the African youth. Just a demographic element that shows why the discussion of micro-credential probably is very important in Africa in general, just to see the demographic growth of Africa in the last couple of years and the decrease of population in the rest of the world is an indicator that probably tools in order to create better and more accessible skills are important. So to sum up, HACWA, and specifically HACWA, then I can say something, and I will say something about the discussion of around micro-credential and modularization in another part of the world, but to finish up with the offer that HACWA, let's say, is, or the role that HACWA can take in this discussion, or HACWA is taking in this discussion in the continent. HACWA has been operating there for at least 10 years in order to generate and to promote broader conditions on the problem of harmonization of higher education in the African continent through different capacity building actions and elements, and engaging key actors in the discussion of African higher education and skilling problem, both at the technical and at the political level. We have been working quite a lot with UNESCO, discussing recognition and issues around the work that UNESCO has been doing in Africa for quite a long time.
Okay.
Now, if I can bring to finalize a perspective from another regions that can enhance the discussion specifically on South Africa, we have been working quite a lot in Latin America. The micro-credentials in Latin America as such exist not under the name micro-credential, but as the name, let's say, extension of the university, the third mission of the university for quite a long time. And there are, in the last couple of years, a very important discussion around the link between micro-credentialization. I don't know if that word exists in English, micro-credentialization of programs and modularization of programs of universities. And this is a challenge that probably is similar in the South African or Southern African context, how universities can work in making their programs more flexible, either through, let's say, promoting micro-credentials or simply by modularizing their programs in order to make them more accessible and more linked to the economic development in the region. I think that's all what I wanted to mention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Patrizzi, for that view from Hakwa, and then also the brief look at Latin America and short courses. Again, like Colleen also said, short courses that have always been there, but looking then at how to unpack perhaps formal qualifications and modularizing them. Our next speaker is Dr. Jaco Olivier from the Commonwealth of Learning. So directly over to you, Jaco.
Thank you very much. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, your screen is visible and you are audible.
Perfect.
Thank you, Jaco.
Perfect. Good morning, Dr. Whitty Green, Dr. Patricia Zawara, Dr. James Kiwi, the Council on Higher Education, and the collaborators on the PoMiSA project. Thank you for the kind invitation to be part of this forum. I'm Jaco Olivier, Advisor Higher Education at the Commonwealth of Learning, and we are based in Vancouver, Canada. And it's really a privilege to present a Commonwealth of Learning perspective on microcredentials today. It's good to see so many familiar faces and names in the meeting. So I'm glad to be amongst friends. So the Commonwealth of Learning, or simply COL, is an intergovernmental organization, and many of you might be aware, and we have collaborated with many of you. And as I said, we're based in Canada, but we are specifically concerned with the promotion and the development of distance education and open learning. And we've got a mission to help governments and institutions and organizations to expand scale, efficiency, and quality of learning by using appropriate open, distance, and technology-based approaches. We are owned by the 56 countries of the Commonwealth. Many of you attending are within that sphere. And we, amongst many things, are interested also in microcredentials. Our footprint, as I said, covers these areas, and we despite myself being based in Vancouver, we also have a center in New Delhi, and we also have regional centers, for example, our SADC CDE, which is located in Botswana, that we support. So in terms of our purpose, we were created to create and widen access to opportunities for learning, and especially making use of distance education methodologies and technologies. And specifically, in terms of our Memorandum of Understanding, one of the objectives of the Commonwealth of Learning is specifically to establish and maintain procedures for the recognition of academic credit. So even when the heads of government from the Commonwealth decided to create the Commonwealth of Learning, the idea of recognition of academic credit, especially across borders, was part of their thinking. Hence, we are specifically mandated to engage on matters related to microcredentials, as well as issues around credit transfer and recognition of prior learning. And we've done some work even within the Southern African area in that regard. Now, turning to microcredentials. The Commonwealth of Learning has defined in our open and distance learning key terms and definitions from 2023, microcredentials as a digital certification, such as a digital badge that provides valid evidence of achievement of specific knowledge, skills, or competences after going through a structured learning experience. And then we also say that microcredentials can be shared on social media and verified by others, including employers. I think this definition might be slightly narrower than the UNESCO definition, but we also align ourselves with the UNESCO definition, despite it not emphasizing the technology aspect as much. But we are also cognizant of alternative definitions where it may also refer to a specific combination of both a credential and a learning experience. I've seen that especially in the British Columbia province here in Canada, where they use the term micro-credential program quite often. And it always refers to the credential together with the course. Whilst in my mind, micro-credential, it says it's a credential. It's something that reflects what has been learned. But as I say, in this part of the world, it's quite common to then just talk about a micro-credential and also refer to the course. So that brings some interesting complications when we talk about this. And I've seen similar practices elsewhere in other publications as well. So it is, I think, essential to have a clear sense of what we're talking about when we talk micro-credentials. But it's not an easy issue. So at Commonwealth of Learning, micro-credentials is not a new topic. We've been working, as I said, in the space for a long time, and we've been working with the issue for a long time. More recently, we had a publication designing and implementing micro-credentials, a guide for practitioners, that was published. But we've also been involved in national capacity building and policy development in Malawi and Zambia, and we've done institutional level work in Namibia as well. We've also been involved in supporting and funding regional initiatives together with the Caribbean Examinations Council, the CXC, for the Caribbean. And they are also our partners in the project that I will mention in a moment. And then also in the Pacific, we've done some work with micro-credentials for flexible learning, both in the higher education sector and then also in the TVET sector. But the work there is also ongoing. And it's also a very unique context, both the Pacific and Caribbean, when it comes to this, where I'm glad to see that in Southern Africa, you've also got a regional approach, but in those two areas, a regional approach is the only approach that is viable because of the nature of the countries and the education systems. Another interesting project that I'll just mention briefly, and we are linked to the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning Foundation in Malta. They are also considered one of our regional centres, but they are also fairly independent. They are busy with NGI Sargasso funded program, specifically looking at micro-credentials and digital identity wallets. And that is maybe something I'd want to flag early on, that colleagues who are working within the micro-credential space should be very cognizant of the very interesting developments that are happening at national level when it comes to digital identity wallets. And sadly, I've seen in many contexts, the people working on these two elements don't really talk. The micro-credentials are often hijacked by higher education or education-related government departments, whilst a totally different government department might be involved with digital identity wallets. In the British Columbia province, for example, they've got a very nice digital identity wallet that you can have on your phone. It's linked also to your medical profile, so you can actually use your phone as a form of identification, and you can also show these are the vaccinations I've had. And that wallet could potentially also be a place where you can put your micro-credentials in, but they haven't done that step. There's no linking there yet. And I know there's some interesting developments around digital identity wallets in Europe and other places as well. But this specific project, we are looking at, intersections between digital identity wallets and micro-credentials in Canada and in Malta and in Europe specifically. So moving on, our main project is this project, and I want to mention this, and then I'll share some of our findings that we found for our research involved in this project. And I know some of the colleagues in the audience might have been involved in this, either as participants or might be aware of some of the upcoming activities. But I think this might also be of use to the attendees today. So we've got a large Commonwealth-wide project that it commenced at the middle of 2024, and this will run up until 2027. The aim of this project is to develop a common Commonwealth credit transfer framework for micro-credentials. The idea of micro-credentials supports mobility of qualifications, and that's important for us, especially across countries. And stacking, as was mentioned a couple of times already today, of many short-term training opportunities to acquire qualifications that are recognized for employment in increasingly competitive and globalized and technology-oriented work environment. That requires, employees to be lifelong learners. So you have to see this not just within the formal education sector, but also wider in terms of lifelong learning. In many instances where I've been in discussions with microcredentials, the importance, and it was also noted a little bit earlier, of microcredentials within industry should not be underestimated. And any policies, any frameworks like this will have to also consider non-formal and informal learning, and how will that fit in. The project that I mentioned, it takes place in 5 phases, of which the research phase has been completed and the consultation phase is now starting. Within Southern Africa, Eastern Africa and the Mediterranean regional meeting, that will be held in Johannesburg on the 24th and 25th of March. I know a couple of you might be part of that. From this month until May, we have 5 regional consultation meetings involving representatives basically from all the member states of the Commonwealth. Further meetings hosted by call and local partners are planned in Abuja in Nigeria for West Africa, Honiara and Solomon Islands for the Pacific, Kingston and Jamaica for the Caribbean, and then for Asia, we'll have a meeting in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So for this project, and ultimately the Commonwealth Credit Transfer Framework, we hope to draw on important work that the PoMiSA project is doing. And I've seen the reports that have been published, and I think that is really important and substantial work. But based on our own research and regional consultation meetings, we hope to develop this framework to be a kind of an inclusive recipe for member states if they want to start, the process of implementing or not just implementing, but planning for implementation and then implementing microcredentials in their context. What can be done? And hopefully we will be sharing some of the preliminary processes that we've developed in the Pan-Commonwealth Forum on Open Learning that will be held in 10 to 12 September in Gaborone in Botswana. And colleagues are welcome to maybe just consider that as an opportunity to come and talk about microcredentials. That is the PCF 11. So you can maybe just look at pcf11.org and you can still submit papers if you're interested. But we aim to support ultimately in the next phase of this project 10 Commonwealth governments in developing microcredentials, frameworks and registries. Hopefully that will be done by June 2026. But we will also then support in the next phase 10 universities. And each of those 10 universities will then create at least 10 microcredentials that will be shared within those national registries. So we ultimately we're aiming to scale this up to as big as possible that our budget will allow. 2 comments I want to maybe just add is the firstly, we aim to complete this framework so that we can submit this to the ministers, the Commonwealth Education Ministers meeting in 2027 to get their endorsement of this framework, and that will potentially, provide opportunities for recognition across borders in terms of what is being done here. And finally, also I want to note that we've realized that in some places it might not be a nationally driven exercise, it might be a regionally driven exercise. As part of this project, as I noted, we have recently completed 3 research reports, one related to research, one on technologies, and one looking at the status of microcredentials in the Commonwealth. And I want to share some findings around the status review specifically. From our research, 8 countries have indicated that they have microcredentials policies and strategies in place. While 9 have indicated there is references in strategies. So there's something, but for the majority of countries, there's nothing at this point. The microcredentials is of interest to provide flexible learning and employable skills to learners. That is what we heard from these participants. And they've indicated that more focus on vocational education is required, but that universities are leading, and that is, I think, aligned with how things are internationally. Sometimes to the detriment of microcredentials, I might add. It's mostly linked to national qualification frameworks and offered in person, but it can be online and blended in terms of the course delivery. There's definitely skills on developing microcredentials needed in all sectors. I will towards the end of the presentation, just share how they are doing it here in Canada. Limited resources or infrastructures available, and hopefully we can guide in our second and third phases many national initiatives and institutional initiatives from our side. But last thing here, microcredential lists and directories are available in some countries, but it's not common. Something else that we heard from the governments is that over 50% of the respondents themselves have acquired at least one microcredential. So there's some awareness, there's continuing education and capacity building, and our partners believe that microcredentials will improve the quality and efficiency of learning, and that their use has enabled increased availability of short-term training opportunities. I want to flag some of the barriers. The state has covered both government officials, but also stakeholders, which are mainly individuals within post-secondary institutions and organizations. For governments, they feel that a barrier would be something like lack of quality assurance, lack of skills and competence to develop microcredentials, and also incentives. For the stakeholders, they say there's this lack of clarity on what the microcredential could be, and I mentioned the issue around the definition, poor understanding about the potential, and also lack of skills and competence to develop a microcredential. Some interesting recommendations from our studies that might also be relevant for you is that there's a hope that the Commonwealth-wide framework will provide a common understanding about microcredentials, and that's a very tricky thing. One of the colleagues at the start mentioned the issue of the number of credits. Just that is enough to make things very complicated, because credits are not the same across different countries, and the number of credits. What was said this morning is totally different from, for example, I know what they define the Australian microcredentials. So once we start counting credits, that'll be enough to block any kind of movement of microcredentials across borders. So we might need to rethink and ask ourselves, why are these numbers so rigid? Who decides? So that is, I think, a point for discussion, I think, for your purposes as well. So more capacity building efforts at national institution levels are required. Quality assurance, as I mentioned, should be priority, and a registry is needed, and finally resources should be put in place. I want to move to a case example. I'm almost finished. Here in British Columbia, I really feel it's relevant to share this with you. At the end of February, we had a CREDEX symposium for microcredentials, and that involved a number of government officials, industry partners, higher education institutions, and other stakeholders with inputs from Canada, Australia, Scotland, Ireland, and USA. And here we found, from my perceptions, listening to the colleagues speaking within this context, is that universities use provincial funding for microcredentials. So the province incentivizes universities to create microcredentials and courses around it. It definitely requires an ecosystem of key stakeholders, government, industry, education institutions, and learners. Incremental credentialing model offers strong microcredential guidelines. Microcredentials should extend beyond courses to informal and non-formal learning. And also a very interesting aspect that was raised at this symposium was how microcredentials can recognize diverse learning, including Indigenous knowledge. And there's some very good examples from Thompson Rivers University here in British Columbia. And if you're interested, I can share some more information with you afterwards. I conclude with the following. Going forward, I would recommend drawing on existing practices and standards. Do not reinvent the wheel. There's been great work done in the region, for example, in Mauritius at national level, with emerging interest in Malawi and Zambia. At institutional, good work has been done by, for example, University of Namibia. And in South Africa, I know there's significant interest in developments at Northwest University and University of Cape Town. Collaborating beyond the educational sector is essential. What about the work done on digital identity wallets? What about the industry and private sector? I hope your meeting includes representatives from industry, because they are the people that might be interested to take this further. They might express their needs in terms of microcredentials within the higher education and education sector. Be clear on the types and scale of credit that a system will cover. And agreeing where microcredentials can be gained and where it may be transferred to would be essential. Finally, identifying who will implement the system and who will benefit from it would be important for us and for you. From top standards, recognition, quality assurance processes must be in place, but without student, institutional, and industry interest and buy-in at grassroots level, any discussion on microcredentials remains a key without a lock, or lighting a candle in broad daylight. Dear colleagues, thank you very much. Over to you, Britta.
Thank you very much, Jaco, for that comprehensive presentation and that view across the Commonwealth, which I think will be very relevant for us with SADC, because there's quite a lot of overlap between the countries, although not a full overlap, I've realized. But thank you very much also for keeping to time. And just colleagues, it's after midnight for Jaco, so just a special word of thank you for you and for staying up for still a while, I think. So our next two speakers are Kun Nomden and Isabella Ladron Arroyo. Kun, can you please share your presentation, or maybe turn on your camera, whichever you prefer, and please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we are together here, Isabel and myself, to present a perspective from the European Union. So we do the presentation in two parts, and Isa will start, and then I will follow.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kun. So what I will first do is like to present indeed what is this European approach to microcredentials that I guess can be very nice to share in this context of like sharing how every region is going about it, right? And then my colleague Kun will present a bit like the more overall framework that is quite new on the Union of Skills, and specifically, and that's something that has also been discussed on another project of the EU and another initiative that is the European Digital Credentials for Learning, that is very much linked in a way to microcredentials. So first of all, just to say that the EU has a great interest on boosting lifelong learning and like a culture of lifelong learning and a culture of upskilling and reskilling of people, so that people spend their life constantly updating their skills in this context that is global, of a race for talent, of a race for skills, and of a lot of changes that's for which we need to adapt by developing the skills, right? So just to show you a bit an example of that, of like this push of the European Union for that, is that it has set some targets related to skills to achieve by 2030. The first one of them is that at least 60% of the adult population should participate in training every year. So to reach this 60%, of course, the learning and training offer has to be flexible and adaptable, and there is where microcredentials has a big role to play. And then the other two targets are related to digital skills. So the aim is that at least 80% of Europeans have at least basic digital skills. And the latest one is related to advanced digital skills, so that at least to have 20 million ICT specialists in the EU. And here there is also a clear goal of gender convergence around this sector. So this is just to set a bit the context of like how microcredentials are very much aligned with these goals of the EU. The point is, as we all know, right, like there are targets, like they go directly to relevant learning, in this case for the labor market. They are small in volume and short in duration, what makes them adaptable and flexible and fit the way that people live, learn, and work. The whole thing with that is that, in a way, microcredentials are already happening, right? Like we heard it this morning, that it might be a new word or a relatively a new word, but it's by no means a new concept, like a small training offers has always been there. And the whole thing is that the certification, like the credential you get after this small volume of learning, is something that has not been regulated. And therefore, it's difficult to understand sometimes, to compare, to give trust to it. So basically, what the EU is doing with the Council recommendation, that is a tool, like a policy tool that the EU has, is to put some order in the way countries within the European Union approach micro-credentials. That's why there is like this key word of like the name of the Council recommendation is a Council recommendation on a European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and for employability. So definitely like their relevance and their usefulness for the labor market is key in this whole effort. The Council recommendation comes from June 2022, and also something important to bear in mind, and that I think is a common challenge also with Southern Africa and like with the region we are discussing here, is that the competence for education and training is at a member state level. That is to say, it's every country who can regulate on that. So what we do from the EU is to support a coordinated approach. And this is the whole thing with the Council recommendation. So we don't have a binding instrument, but we definitely make our best so that countries get together and try to get this common European approach that can facilitate a lot like mobility and understandability of these micro-credentials. So the rationale behind that I've already started to introduce a bit is to boost the quality, the trust, and the uptake of micro-credentials, because we are like trustful that by making these micro-credentials more transparent, people would trust them more, the quality may increase, but also the uptake may increase because let's not forget that the overall goal is to boost this mindset of lifelong learning and that people are all throughout their life upskilling and reskilling, adapting to the needs of society and of the labor market. So the whole idea is this, is like to make these micro-credentials easier to compare and easier to understand across the EU. So in this slide that it's a bit heavy is basically what is the content of the substance of this Council recommendation. So first of all, 3 building blocks that I will develop a bit better later is that it proposes a common definition for micro-credentials that, as we see, is not something to take for granted. So that's already indeed like a contribution of this Council recommendation. Secondly, it also lists a set of standard elements to include when describing a micro-credential. So it does not say things has to be this way, but however you do things, please describe this, and that. And I will go later so that I can be more concrete on what do we mean by standard elements. And finally, it also lists and explains a set of principles to follow for the design and the issuance of micro-credentials according to this European approach. So these would be like the 3 building blocks of the Council recommendation. And then what are the key areas for action that the Council recommendation propose or invite member states to do is like, first of all, to develop ecosystems for micro-credentials. That means that it is not only on the person, on the issuer of the micro-credential to work on that, but it's really about bringing together all stakeholders, like for example, in that case, who would need to read and to understand this micro-credential? Is it employers? Okay, then employers' organizations should also be on the table. What this micro-credential will be useful for, like for example, setting certain working conditions. Then social partners, including trade unions, of course, should also be at the table to make sure that this is considered in the design and in the issuance of the micro-credential. Of course, learners as well, like taking into account their needs. And in the end, we said that the whole thing with micro-credentials is that they facilitate that people engage in lifelong learning, right? So for them to be flexible and to really meet the needs of the potential learners, they should be heard and considered. So that's a bit the whole idea with creating ecosystems. And then, of course, like registries, inclusion in the national qualification frameworks, like is a big list of things, but like to create this, like this environment for them to thrive and for being understood. Then the second point of action has to do with deliver on the potential of micro-credentials, and finally, how the Commission can support them. And then this last part is maybe also interesting to share like the way that the EU approached that, is that the focus of the Council recommendation on micro-credentials is twofold. on the one hand, has to do with education, training, and skills policies, but also with active labor market policies. Actually, my colleague Koen and myself, we work at the DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, and we deal with micro-credentials from this angle. So really just to stress the importance of micro-credentials for employability. So now I will pass quickly through the 3 points, like the 3 building blocks that makes part of the Council recommendation, just to be a little bit more specific on the substance of this EU approach. So first of all, what is the common definition that the EU proposed? First of all, is that we consider micro-credential to the record of the learning outcome that a learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. So in this discussion that we already have heard before of like whether micro-credentials is that the training course or is a certification, for this purpose, we call about the record of the learning outcome. So it is the credential itself. But of course, we non-stop use micro-credential as well to referring to the training. But like for the purpose of regulating and putting order on that, we refer to the record of the learning outcome. Also to stress that it is very important, this idea of learning outcome. So it's not about recording what has been taught, but what the learner has gotten after this learning experience. Like what is the learner able to do, or what does it know now that didn't know before? And then also, like another point, it's been very useful to come in this position after the other 3 presentations because I can refer to them, right? And we've been discussed about like when is micro, right? And when is not anymore a micro credential, like that size matters. So in this case, like the EU only agreed to define it as a small volume of learner to make it more inclusive, the definition, so that, because in the end, like, as I said, this is about like putting together the approach of different 27 member states and of very many different sectors. So that's not only for universities, it's also, as you said, for industry, micro-credentials, chambers of commerce, NGOs, trade unions, like an endless set of stakeholders that are delivering training and then certifying it, and that needs to be included also in this definition of micro-credentials. But also a key point of the definition is that those learning outcomes need to be assessed against transparent and clearly defined criteria. And then the whole idea as well is that the micro-credentials are owned by the learner and can be shared and portable. And this is very much related to the presentation that my colleague Koen will do later. And another point that has been discussed as well is that those micro-credentials may be standalone, and that's already sufficient, or may also be combined into larger credentials, and therefore like this idea of stackability. And a fundamental point for the EU approach is that micro-credentials need to be underpinned by quality assurance, following like standards that are relevant for the sector or for the area where the learning activity happened. But this idea, this notion of quality assurance is a big challenge that we keep working on, but that is fundamental for the definition of a micro-credential. Then the second building block of the Council recommendation is the standard elements that need to be included to describe a micro-credential. So somehow is as I was saying, right? Like those are like the list of things that you need to be transparent about. So first of all, like identification of the learner, for example, or what is the title of the micro-credential? Where is the country or the region of the issuer? Who was the awarding body? What is the date of issuing, for example? What are those learning outcomes? And just to explain the way in which it tries to put some order while keeping the flexibility is that one of the standard elements is like, what is the notional workload needed to achieve the learning outcomes? So we have these systems like the ECTS system for the credit transfer. So the whole idea is, and that was already said before, is like such an instrument already exists, right? So whenever it's possible, please use it. Like please, in your micro-credential, according to the European approach, use ECTS when you have them in place and when it's possible to define your notional workload this way. But of course, that cannot be mandatory to say it in ECTS because maybe you are an actor in the system that does not have this. That can be the case, for example, of certain VET providers like vocational education and training providers. So in that case, please define your notional workload somehow else but define it. So this is the whole thing. Like this would be an instrument to boost transparency so that we can more easily understand and compare microcredentials while keep giving them the flexibility that actually makes them also useful, right? That they are agile, they respond to labor market needs. So if we over-regulate, we might kill that beauty, while at the same time, if we don't try to put some order, then they become a bit, or they lose their potential or their usefulness because they are not understood by the people and the actors that need to understand them. So that's a bit like a constant trade-off that we try to play with, and that I guess is also a fundamental question of the discussion in this forum. And then finally, what are the principles for the design and issuance of microcredentials? So the Council recommendation proposed those. There is actually an Annex 2, that elaborate a bit on them. And as I said, a fundamental principle is, for example, quality, transparency, the relevance, and maybe like just not to go through all of them, but like to point, to point something that can be interesting is the idea that microcredentials should be learner-centered. Like microcredentials have a big potential for social inclusion, in the sense that there is so many people for whom access to education and training in formal or traditional ways is not so easy. And leveraging on the flexibility of microcredentials can be an opportunity for them to actually get closer to the labor market and acquire the skills that they may need for social inclusion in general, but also in the labor market. And I said in general because, for example, like for reaching this objective, this target of like at least 80% of people having basic digital skills, right? Like this is useful for anything, like for accessing the public administration that is every time more digitalized, or like banking services, and also, of course, and fundamentally for the labor market. But for this, it's fundamental that when designing and issuing microcredentials, we keep in mind what are the target and what are the potential learners and the limitations and the challenges or the needs that they can have, right? And therefore designing the microcredential around it if we really want to like tap on this potential of microcredentials for social inclusion. So yeah, that's a bit the idea with the principles. In this slide, what I present is like a lot of research and work that has been done around microcredentials. So after having present like the council recommendation that, let's say, is like the main policy document that guide our work, just to say that there is also like other institution that has been done a lot around it. So for example, CEDEFOP, that is the agency that do research around vocational education and training in the EU, is based in Greece. They've done like a lot of work. Here is like difficult to visualize, but I wanted to put it for when sharing the slides afterwards, you can access to that. Then the European Training Foundation has done a guide to help stakeholders in the design, issuance, and recognition of microcredentials. So also very much in line with the work presented before. And also the OECD had like some implementation project on microcredentials that you might be interested to look at. Like they focus specifically on 4 countries: Finland, the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Spain, and look at like how were they doing on the implementation of microcredentials. So just to quickly show this overview of like other maybe useful resources for your project or for your interest. And then finally, my last slide is on the ongoing work of microcredentials from the European Commission. So what are we doing now? So at the moment, we are finalizing, we are about to publish actually, so I invite you to follow it whenever it's ready. It will be soon, like in a couple of weeks, a report on the state of implementation by member states, so by countries, of this council recommendation that I have presented before. So basically the council recommendation said member states are invited to do this, and that. And what we do in this report is to check, to monitor how are they doing in this implementation. So it's kind of like a very promising piece of information to look more at detail, how is it going at an aggregate level, but also very interesting from a qualitative perspective to get good practices and to get ideas of like, so see, like in this country, they are approaching it this way, or in this country, they are approaching it this other way. And also something that is interesting about this report is that we focus both in higher education, so at what universities are doing, but also specifically on VET, on vocational education and training, like how microcredentials are being used and implemented in this vocational and education and training sector, and also how are microcredentials being used for this second focus that I presented. I don't know if you remember a couple of slides before, on active labor market policies. So how, for example, public employment services are using microcredentials for the sake of like helping people to get back or to reorient their career in the labor market. Then another way that the European Commission supports the implementation of microcredentials is via funds. So with the European Social Fund, but also with Erasmus Plus fund. So there is like ongoing 12 projects of forward-looking projects. That's like a way we call some of them, and then other policy experimentation projects that are going on. And I also add the link so that if you are curious about it, you can take a look and see what is going on and like how, from a more bottom-up approach, things are being developed and implemented. And finally, something we also do is like to organize peer learning activities among member states to share practices. And that's actually a way to share like not only good practices, but also why not like challenges and issues and pain points that they have and how did they overcome it or how they are on their way to do it. So we had a couple of them last year, and we have an upcoming one at the end of May, on the 21st and 22nd of May, specifically on the role of engaging stakeholders for delivering on the potential of microcredentials. That was something that has also been commented, right? Like the importance of like not doing something like a microcredential on our own when we are about to issue it or to design it, but to consider actually like all the stakeholders that might be interested afterwards on that, including for sure social partners, so that the relevance of the microcredential is guaranteed via this means. And I invite you very much, like this is not like a public activity, but as it is online, we have some leeway to have other participants. So when you are like authorities who works on microcredentials and you might be interested on following it, please don't hesitate to drop me an email, and I'll be happy to do my best to get you in if that's of your interest. So that's all on my side. And now I pass the floor to my colleague Kun, who will present the Union of Skills and also these European digital credentials for learning that are very complementary to this work on microcredentials. Thanks a lot for your attention. I'm very happy to take any question that you may have whenever is a moment for that. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. And dear ladies and gentlemen, I realize that we are going a bit over time, so I will be really short in my presentation. What we wanted to do, and this is on the next slide, is to just make you aware of the Union of Skills communication that was adopted by the European Commission 2 weeks ago, and which really sets a strategy in relation to skills at European Union level for the next years, and which really places also skills in the context of employability and European competitiveness. And the reason for this is, and that's on the next slide, that Europe faces, like many other countries in the world, skill shortages, labor shortages, skills gaps. That there is also, maybe we can move to the next one, that we also do have, can we move to the next? Yeah, excellent. That we also do have a transformation speed gap, like in other countries, education and training systems lag behind, cannot cope with emerging needs. And of course, that means more importance for microcredentials. And then in this context, also a focus on skills intelligence. We can move to the next slide. In this Union of Skills, and this is very much related to the targets that Isabel presented in the beginning, everyone in Europe should be empowered to develop skills, and that competitive companies can also find people with the right skills. And there again, microcredentials play a role as they are tools for flexible learning. And the third point, and this is quite important in the context of the Union of Skills, is the focus really more than in previous skills agenda presentations on skills transparency, on qualifications transparency, trust, and also recognition. And in this picture, of course, also micro-credentials play a role. If we go to the next slide, so actually this Union of Skills is based on 4 objectives. Allow people to build skills for quality lives and for jobs. So it's there is also a quality job strategy that will be adopted very soon. Focus is on upskilling and reskilling, and in order to make critical transitions, digital transitions, but also the green transitions. We talk a bit less about it, but the globe has a huge climate problem, and a green transition is needed. And in the specific European context, of course, we talk about circulation, because we should not forget, in the European Union, 27 member states, education policy is at national level. What we can do at European level is quite limited, but we can focus it on circulating skills, making it easier, and we will come to that later. I would propose now to skip the next few slides, but you will have them in terms of documentation, just to stand still here at the Skills Portability Initiative, an initiative as part of the Union of Skills, specifically focusing on addressing barriers to workers' mobility and building on existing transparency tools. And then we talk in particular about the European qualifications framework, because despite the existence of the European qualification framework, there is still, let's say, not a situation of, there are still issues with recognition of skills and qualifications within the EU, let alone, of course, in a more global context. What I can say is that the Union of Skills also focuses quite a lot on micro-credentials and suggests to expand the use of micro-credentials as flexible learning solutions, and that where relevant, micro-credentials should be linked to national and European qualifications frameworks. Also a focus on more joint micro-credentials in the vocational area and in the higher education area. In this context, I think because we are in a Southern African forum, we have been working on comparing the European qualifications framework with the Southern African Development Community qualifications framework. So a comparison report has been prepared, and it should be published very soon. My last slides are on 2 other elements, namely, and we can move on, namely that's of how do you issue actually micro-credentials. And we see a tendency, and it's not automatically given, but we see a tendency and also a need, I would say, to adopt more digital credentials. We are in a digitalizing world. Digital credentials give security, trust, and we have developed an infrastructure based on the technology of verifiable credentials. And digital credentials can enhance recognition. They can allow you to much better showcase knowledge and skills. In this context, also skills taxonomies are crucial. The next slide refers to the infrastructure that we have put in place. And this was already referred to also by previous speakers. So it's all related to actually one ecosystem with also registries, with a personal identity. And also, of course, digital credentials allow to share digital credentials very easily, but also to third parties to verify the authenticity and validity of the credential. Now, this infrastructure is available on the so-called Europass platform, but also available as open source. I will post a few links in the chat. And now my last slide, also not unimportant, is about interoperability. I think this is crucial within a region like the Southern African region. This is essential also within the European Union, but I think we can even think more broadly, globally. This is also important. And that's the issue of interoperability. And for this, we have developed the European learning model as a data model on semantic standards that is multilingual, and in the field of learning, it covers all levels and all forms of learning, covers the full life cycle course. And for example, it builds on the European recommendations on the qualifications framework, but also on micro-credentials. And it's very much related to also the strategy for data. Policy is very much on open data. The European learning model, and I will post the link, is also free for use and just publicly accessible. So it plays an important role in Europe, but can also play an important role more widely. And we recently had also discussions with the African Continental Qualifications Framework. Given time, I would like to stop here and give back the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Koen, and thank you for speeding it up a little bit. And thanks, Isabel, for that comprehensive overview of how the European framework works for microcredentials. Can I just ask all the speakers that are online that you check the chat as well as the question and answer part? Jaco, for example, there's a question for you in the Q&A that I saw. If you can just please respond to those online. And then our last of our panel speakers is Dr. Chakroon from UNESCO. So over to you, Dr. Chakroon. Do you please share your presentation if you have it, or otherwise you can just speak.
Thank you very much, Chair, and very good morning to colleagues. Let me first of all really acknowledge and appreciate my colleagues in South Africa, France, also colleagues and friends in SADC region that I have been working with for many times. And of course, beyond that, let me acknowledge the fellow speakers, my colleague, of course, Koen, Isabel, Colleen, that I didn't meet for a while, and Jaco and Nicholas as well. It's a really pleasure, and I look forward for learning and engaging with all of you. I have prepared very short presentation, and I hope you can see it. So basically, I would like to start first of all, and I think what we have heard from all colleagues and building on what they have said, I mean, we can see that globally there is an increasingly promoted, I would say, agenda around more flexible pathways for learning, more recognizing different set of skills and competence. And this is something that we can see in all contexts and in all region, and placing it within a lifelong learning perspective. We also see this growing, I would say, landscape of credentialing, and I will come back to that later. And a form of, we can consider as a proliferation of credentials, but we can see it as Koen was presenting at the end, more a system perspective, and I will come back to that. There is also an attention to how we can trust and value different learning settings and different contexts, but also different learning outcomes that probably we didn't have before, and we are considering that. Also, we need to consider cross-border recognition and how we that interoperability, transferability within a specific context, but also across regions within a specific region like the SADC. And I think the PoMiSA project is a very important one that is trying to advance that. But I think is also there is an attention from policymakers, and we see it in national strategies and national education policies, but also from scholars, from researchers and educators regarding microcredentials. So I would say it's like a movement that probably is not structured movement, but there is a movement, and our conversation today is a good example of that. Probably there are some features that are interesting in our discussion is one, the granularity of learning and learning outcomes, and it came from colleagues who spoke before me, the timeliness and a fast track or quick learning pathways that can help people acquire the set of skills, and aspects related to accessibility, alternative pathways, stackability, and we have heard also both from Jaco and also from Koen and Isabel, the technology dimension in this case. So all this promotes a bit the work that all of us are doing in trying to understand the landscape, trying to define microcredentials, and trying to provide that policy support and assistance that member states need to advance their own agenda. So why do we need a definition? I think is very important. While my presentation, we didn't adopt at UNESCO a definition, and it's very important. At UNESCO, definition is adopted by member states. This is the work that we have been doing, and the technical work. It attempts to provide a space for conversation and that can advance our agenda. And of course, we can see that some regions, some countries have adopted a clear definition, and it's very important to understand where are we heading with a common understanding of the microcredentials, and maybe a common language around that is needed at national, regional, and the global level. So what we have done, I mean, in this context, and I'm building my presentation on different pieces of work that we have done already a few years ago on proposing a definition and analysis of definitions related to microcredentials, a work that my colleagues at the Institute for Planning have done on flexible learning pathways in higher education, and work that we are doing right now, and my colleague Katerina Nyanyadu, who is also on the call today, is leading that work that tries to capture a bit experience across the globe on microcredential policies, program, but also initiatives. But we looked at different aspects, and some of them were mentioned by colleagues, so I will not spend a lot of time on them, but we looked at the certification, we looked at link with other credentials, and I think this came on different part of the interventions earlier, the outcomes and assessment processes, the standards and quality assurance, the purpose of the microcredential, the duration, ownership, portability, shareability as well, the providers and who is delivering, security and mode of delivery. And we came to this definition that we have proposed already to colleagues, and that I wanted to present again. A microcredential is a record of focused learning achievements, verifying what the learner knows, understands, and can do. It includes an assessment based on clearly defined standards and is awarded by a trusted provider. It has a standalone value and may also contribute or complement other macro credentials, and that's the stackability that we are speaking about, including through recognition of prior learning. And I think this is an important aspect that didn't come yet earlier, maybe in the discussion, but it's important to understand how we acquire also microcredential. And we, in the proposal, we also refer to the possibility for acquiring microcredential through recognition of prior learning. And that means a standard required by relevant quality assurance. And this is something that obviously is about building trust and the value for microcredential. Sorry for the heavy text, but I think Colleen was referring to the challenge of placing microcredentials within a broad understanding of credentialing and how we understand macrocredentials versus microcredentials. And I think that definition is important, is why we do consider microcredential as a microcredential versus a macrocredential. But obviously, this is about some aspects that are important, and I mentioned some of them. But I think the granularity is an important aspect. Eventually, the time is another aspect, and the access to it. But is that link between micro and macro regarding the stackability? But it's not necessarily the case, meaning we can acquire microcredentials without necessarily having an objective of stackability. That depends on the objective, on the provider, but also on the learner and the purpose for the learning itself. Now, what we didn't achieve, and this is something that probably require further discussion, is there were less agreement among the consultation that we conducted on the recognition of prior learning should be included or not. We know that not everywhere recognition of prior learning is an established mechanism, and we know from the global inventory, we know from our work also on higher education, that many countries are still reluctant regarding the recognition, although, as I would refer to that later, the Global Convention on Recognition of Higher Education Qualification, the Regional Convention do refer to the possibility for recognizing prior learning. Also, regarding the provider, how we how we define the provider and how we define the competent organization, the recognized bodies, trusted provider. These are things that obviously require some definition and some agreement. And obviously the quality assurance, how much quality assurance? And that's, I think, always the challenge between a flexible and agile learning path and learning outcomes assessment and a heavy, eventually bureaucratic process of quality assurance. What is the trade-off is something that has to be considered. Now, this comes in a way in a system where, let me say, we have to consider how to move from a jungle of credentials to a system of credentials. And in a way, it echoes what Koen was mentioning. We have a wide range of tools that represent learning outcomes and represent credentials in the form or another, from learner records to badges to skills passport to micro-credentials and qualifications. And the question for all of us is how we can build more coherent system, how we make these different tools support learners and support the lifelong learning objective. I think that's what is challenging for us as a community, as an international community, and that's a challenge for you working in this context. And when we looked at the country cases and systems, we have noted also that there are, in some countries, you can see the linkages between micro-credentials and learners' records. That's the case of Australia. You can see the linkage between micro-credentials and skills passport. That's the case of British Columbia. So there are these issues that we will have to identify and we would need to understand as well. Now, when we looked at definition, again, sorry for the heavy text, but we were looking at definitions from different contexts and different countries, from Australia to Jordan to Peru. And I think what comes as important in the analysis of the definition is how broad and how specific are the definitions. They can be very broad, like the case of maybe Canada. They can be very, very specific, like the case of New Zealand, where you are defining the number of credit, you are defining the leveling, you are defining the assessment, etc. So the question is, what is more interesting for learners? And what is more valuable for recognizing those micro-credentials? A broad definition or specific definition? I think context matters here, and I would not make a judgment, but I think it's part of the analysis that we have to do, how broad we would like to have as definition to be inclusive and how specific to give it value. And I think that's the equation that we need to take. Now, in the analysis we are doing, there are a few aspects that, and they come in the different framework that colleagues have presented. I think Jaco referred to that, also Koen and Isabel, is what are the elements of analysis that we need to consider? Of course, the definition is important, but I think policy, strategies, and framework are critical. Why we are setting up why we are using micro-credentials. And we can see from the analysis we are having, you can have it in a macro strategy. That's the case of Jordan. They are referring to micro-credentials in a socioeconomic strategy, in a kind of sustainability strategy. But you can see it also related to policy on education and training. That's the case of India. That's the case of Canada in different provinces. And we can see it also in other contexts. We also see from the context of the jurisdictions, federal, and that's the case of Australia, Canada, again, national, that's the case of a country like Jordan, regional, and this is the case of Peru, and institutional. And we have seen also that universities, for example, or providers are having framework and strategies. How aligned are they? That's something that context matter here, and I think it's very important that when we are looking at the framework, we need to consider the context. Also, the design and delivery is very important. Is how the learning micro-credentials are designed and who is delivering them, and how they are delivered, in which form. Is it online? Is it hybrid? Is it in presence? Is it in workplace learning? Is it in other contexts? So I think the delivery matters. The quality assurance, recognition, accreditation matter. But I wanted to focus on other aspects that maybe colleagues didn't go into details on them. First, the employer's perception and how these micro-credentials are valued by employers. Unfortunately, we have less evidence about that, and in the case studies, we see less data coming from it. Learners' perception, how learners value or consider it as a tool or as a scheme that is helping them address their learning needs. Providers' perception, is it something that help providers increase their program, make their program more relevant to the demand, be it from individuals or from the labor market, is something that I think we need more data, we need more evidence. And that's about data, evidence, and public information across the country cases that we have looked at. Only Australia had administrative data on microcredentials, and it was mixed with other awards. So today, when we are looking at data and evidence, we have much less information about how many people get microcredential, in which context, with which quality assurance. So I think that investment on data and evidence of outcomes is something that require our collective engagement, but also the public information. I mean, how much information is accessible about the microcredentials, about their value, about the delivery, about quality assurance, is something that we have seen in some countries. And we have seen, for example, in British Columbia, there is an attention to public information on microcredentials and the support. Equity and inclusion, and I think this is very important. In the case studies we have looked at, for example, British Columbia, you have minority groups. But one interesting example I wanted to mention is we have identified in Peru a microcredential through WhatsApp group for 10 to 15 minutes of learning with a microcredential stacked to it. I think, and that's about reaching the vulnerable population, the less favorable conditions for access to learning. And I was really amazed by this case, because I think that's what we are trying to do. We want to leave no one behind. And that means that we cannot only have a Ferrari for people who already have maybe a Mercedes, but we want to have a bike for people who are working with empty hands. And I think this is something that it should drive us when we look at microcredentials. Finally, innovation and digitalization is, of course, and Jaco referred to that, Koen, Isabel referred to that, is about how we leverage the technology, how we advance some of the or say, AI and other tools that can help us also leverage microcredentials. Chris, I'm conscious about the time, so I would like to move to why it's important also to consider international and regional dialogue. And I think PoMiSA project is very important in this case. And I would like to refer to our global convention and regional convention on higher education, on recognition of higher education qualifications. By now, we have 100 countries who ratified the global or the regional and regional convention. And it's very important that means there is a critical mass of countries who do apply fair, transparent, inclusive recognition of qualification concerning higher education, of course, in this case. But what is interesting is that while we are not defining microcredentials in those conventions, we are not giving a clear indication, but we do recognize the partial studies, and we do recognize different forms of qualifications. And there is in the convention state parties' responsibility to recognize these partial qualifications that could be understood in different ways, and including microcredentials. So there is in a way, commitment from the state parties who ratified the convention to basically engage with microcredentials and to have a fair and transparent recognition of those credentials and microcredentials acquired elsewhere. So there is a basis for regional, international, and global, I would say, engagement for the recognition of microcredentials. Last but not least, what should be the potential objective for international cooperation and the Sustainable Development Agenda, and that I think what you are trying to do in PoMiSA? One is obviously knowledge sharing and peer learning, and we need that. And what we have heard from the Commonwealth, from Europe, from the SADC region, is very important, because we can learn together, we can share knowledge and build together. that we also work toward more inclusive and framework for fair recognition for all. And that engagement is very important. That we respect still domestic laws and institutional autonomy, and it's very important that we take that into consideration, but also that we facilitate mobility through reference framework. It can be common recognition procedures, but it can be more transparent framework for recognition. I think that's what should drive us. And let me thank again the organizers, thank my fellow speakers and colleagues, and look forward for James' moderation today. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chakroon, and also for being as conscious of time as you were. I think your example of not creating a Ferrari for somebody who already has a Mercedes, but rather creating a bicycle for somebody who's walking or has nothing. For me, that was very, very potent. And I think for us in Southern Africa, very important to keep that aspect in mind as well. Colleagues, thank you very much. So we have completed the part where the panel has presented their views. Before we go into the conversation that James will lead for us, I've had a few requests for people to just have a 10-minute break or so. So let's just have a leg stretch, have a 10-minute break. It's 11:10 now in South Africa. So 10 minutes will make it 20 past. So please don't run away too far, because I think
you're on the screen in the room, and if you're online, maybe you want to just pin the videos, then it can be good. I'm just missing Nicholas. Oh, Nicholas, you are there. Just want to check if you're on the screen. If you can just pin Nicholas as well at the back. Just give us a second. Aha, perfect. All right, thanks, colleagues. Let's get started then. This is going to be quite an informal session. I have shared a couple of questions with each of you. As you were speaking, I changed the questions a bit. So in case you're wondering what I'm going to ask you, you might want to just go look at that again. I tried not to change too much, but I thought there were some just useful things that came up, and we don't want to repeat, of course, what you did in your presentations. So maybe as a way of introduction, I think two things that are top of mind for me is the ACQF. Koen, you mentioned it, Colleen to some extent as well. There's some really interesting continental work happening, and I think we need to recognize it. There is also a set of continental guidelines that have been developed by the ACQF on microcredentials. So this work was done late last year. The group met in the Seychelles, and if anybody's interested in that, you will find it on the ACQF website. So some really interesting recent work on microcredentials on our continent. The other part that I think is important to note is the SADC region as well, and the work of the SADC region in these kind of spaces. We all spoke about it. As SADC member countries, together with our 3 European member states in PoMiSA, we are all really committed to working in SADC. One of the outcomes of PoMiSA will be to support the SADC Secretariat with a set of regional guidelines on microcredentials. So these things are all in motion. The risk, of course, is that we develop documents and policies and regulations that just sit on a shelf. So that is not the purpose. But just to give you a sense that these discussions are happening and happening at quite some speed. Maybe just a quick reflection, and then I'll hand over to the first question to you, Maureen. Colleen, I got some really interesting things from you today. Colleen has been working in this space with me for a long time. And I think Colleen really summarized what's happening in South Africa, at least, but also, our lens very well. Nicholas, it was interesting to hear from you from a different perspective. Tuning has been with us for a very long time. And it's interesting that there are mechanisms we've been used, long before we spoke about microcredentials that are still relevant. It's the same kind of idea. It's just, different terminologies that we speak about. So, if you can talk about tuning a little bit now, it could be helpful. Jaco, you mentioned the kind of secret word for me that I think really needs to be unpacked around digital identity. I think this is core in terms of all the work that we're talking about. And, people skip over the digital identity and let's talk about credentials and data and so on. For me, one of the key things that, I would hope you can unpack a little bit in our questions today is the concept of digital identity. For me, that's really key. Isabel and Kun, you said all the right things. You even had a pet on your slides, Isabel, as I said, because I thought that was kind of nice. But look, there's no doubt that the European Commission is far ahead when it comes to the things that we're talking about today. And this is not a competition. This is about learning from each other. And so many of the good things Kun and you and I have been talking and working together for many years, you know, the European Commission has the benefit of working on these things for many years now, where the part of the world that we're talking about from today has not had that opportunity, and some of the things are only starting. So in a way, we're learning from each other. The key probably for us within Africa and Southern Africa is to contextualize what we're doing. Maureen, I think you mentioned this as well, and Colleen. You know, we're not copy and pasting from any part of the world. The European Commission examples are phenomenal and exciting and impressive. But many of them will be the Mercedes Ferrari example that Maureen mentioned, as opposed to, you know, just getting the basics in place. And so as African countries, we also need to be careful what is contextually appropriate for us. And then maybe, Maureen, I think you and I have been working too long together, so I kind of knew what was going to be on your slides. There was something really interesting that came up from your side. I think, you know, the question that I would pose to you as we maybe start now, Maureen, is how is what you spoke about today different from qualifications frameworks? So you spoke about microcredentials and a jungle of microcredentials. I remember 15, 20 years ago, and this is not a problem, surely people in the audience, when you're doing this too long, you get lots of gray hairs and things come around again. So when we started with qualification frameworks, we spoke about a jungle of qualifications. Now, so interesting, Maureen, that you spoke about a jungle of microcredentials today. So my first question to you, and maybe if you can keep the response to maybe 2 to 3 minutes. What do you mean with a system of microcredentials? And is that the same thing as a qualifications framework, or is it something different? Thanks, Maureen. Over to you.
Thank you, James, for difficult questions. Let me say what is different, and then what is still valid. First, what is different? I think context is different today. We are in a situation where economies are changing very fast. They are not changing at the same pace across regions. And I think when we are speaking about digital, we need to be careful with the digital divide. And we know that we have 2.6 billion people that are not connected to internet, that 1/3 of the students do not have access to devices and computers, that in Africa, 60% of schools do not have electricity. So I think it's very important that we contextualize that and that we don't think about a solution that will not necessarily be accessible to everybody. And that's why it's important that we think about high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech solutions in this context. But context is different vis-a-vis discussion 20 years ago because of the change in the labor market and the way we see digital and also greening impacting the economies. We also see how people are learning and engaging in learning in different ways in different contexts. Probably what is also different is that countries understood that you need to offer different schemes for different people, and the needs might be different, and you need much more flexible learning pathways, learning systems. And this is something that probably we didn't speak about at the time when we were looking at the first generation, second generation, and we reached fourth generation of national qualification framework. But the global inventory shows that there are still many countries that are very far from having implemented the national qualification framework. And I had a slide that didn't show, but we know that we have countries that are still at the early stages of developing national qualification framework. Others are in a rather experimental stage. Others are reviewing and renewing their qualification framework. I think it's important also to take into account that distinctions. Now, what is, I think, common is this attention to learners and how learners can benefit from whatever system of credentialing that is in place and eventually respond to their needs. I think that's an attention that comes from the presentation, and also when you read the objectives of those framework that are in place. What is, I think, of course, a matter of attention is, are we really measuring that fitness for purpose, that responsiveness to learning needs? I'm not sure about that, and I think this will require attention. Now, why is important that we think jungle and we think system? First, jungle, it's not only about, it's not what I was maybe referring to, it's not jungle of micro-credentials, it's jungle of credentials and different representation tools. You, of course, you have a sub-jungle of micro-credentials that we need to address. And why we need to have a system is about, system means interconnectiveness, means interoperability, means transferability. I think that's what we need to build. I'm not sure we have a system now. I think we need to act on more systemic approach, and I'm not sure we have it. We need to have the basis for that, and maybe that's part of the discussion. Is what are the elements that will make a jungle a system? Transparency, trust, interoperability are at least three aspects that we need to take into account. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Paureen. Isabel, I just want to jump to you, maybe building on that. Is a credential and a qualification the same thing in your view, or are they different?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And the line is maybe a bit blurred, right? Like we can talk about qualifications, and for this, my colleague Koen is way more expert than I am. So please feel free to jump in. But like when there is like a traditional system behind, like a standardized ways, when the public authorities are behind, and maybe a credential is something more flexible, more comprehensive, that also includes like industry and labor market driven, like certified trainings. So let's say that credential is a broader system, that definitely that it's a more comprehensive or more flexible term than a qualification. But of course, we are every time in this world of definitions, like moving a very like there is a very thin line, right, in this, because for example, like we discussed very much, and this already happens in at the EU level, about the inclusion of micro-credentials in national qualification frameworks. So they are part, right, like by the very name of these qualification frameworks, like these credentials or these micro-credentials. And still we can say there is a difference. We normally talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, Koen, about traditional qualifications and then micro-credentials or other type of credentials. So I would say that this is a bit like the lines we move around. Yeah.
So a lot of what you all spoke about today is about terminology, isn't it? MISA, macro, credential, qualification, training course, you know, all of these things come together in a way that something's happening in the world where it feels like the debate we're having is actually a proxy for something else that is happening. And, you know, maybe we can talk about that proxy a little bit. And I would relate for me a little bit to some of the comments a couple of you made, where supply and demand side conversations are starting to merge. So the terminology on the supply side would be qualifications and training programs, where the conversation or the terminology on the demand side could be maybe credentials, skills programs, job opportunities. And it feels like these two worlds are starting to come together a bit more. But look, I mustn't do too much talking. I must ask questions. So Jaco, just a quick question to you, and then Colleen, I'll come to you next. Jaco, in your view, when we talk about frameworks and platforms, do you think these two concepts, to talk about terminology again a little bit, are interrelated, or do you think they are very different? And I'm sorry for throwing the question at you. It just came to mind, and I thought you might be the best person to answer. So a framework versus a platform, your view.
Again, it will depend on how you approach it and how it is framed within a specific context. But to my mind, a framework would be something wider. It's more the process to be followed by a government or an institution, whilst the platform would be more a technical thing. A platform would be, in my mind, something like a registry where you have, an aggregation of microcredentials that are stored there. That would be my short answer to this. But the two, will have an influence on each other. In my mind, a platform might be one of the deliverables of a framework, or something that you would put as a part of the framework. But let me stop there. Yeah.
I think it's helpful. So, Jaco, just to follow up, the Virtual University of Small States of the Commonwealth was an early idea of the space that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the VASC today, and how does it relate to our conversations, if you feel comfortable, just to give us a sense of where that's going?
Yes, VASC is an interesting, focus within the Commonwealth of Learning. The idea behind it was to actually create a real virtual university for small states. I don't think we are there, and we might not get there very soon. But I think within this discussion that we're having now, VASC has got a very important role to play. The progress that has been made in the Caribbean has been specifically because of linkages that we have within the VASC. And I know you've also been involved with some of the VASC work in the past. And I think that kind of recipe could be something that others can also draw on. The idea within the Virtual University of Small States was to have a transnational qualifications framework. And something like that has the potential to support alignment of microcredentials with recognized qualification levels, allowing credit transfer across institutions. So it's got the potential, but currently we're not there yet. But if there's enough of a drive from the governments who make up that grouping, then yes, it could be possible. And at this point, there's excitement around microcredentials. So I think that there's some positivity around this.
In some ways, it was a kind of idea before its time. Long before we spoke about all of this, the VASC was developed. So, that's, I think, very positive for Cole. Jaco, I'll come back to you just now, but I want you to just think about, you mentioned this credit transfer framework for microcredentials. I think that's an interesting idea that perhaps we can unpack a little bit in a few minutes. But let me switch to Colleen. Colleen, just around definitions, you spoke a lot about definitions. Do you think that a qualifications framework can accommodate non-formal and informal credentials in a country like South Africa, or perhaps one of our neighboring countries? Do you think that's feasible?
Well, I'm not sure about this question, because at the moment we are recognizing non-formal and informal learning through recognition of prior learning. So I'm not sure how else we will want to do that. That's all I can say, is that at the moment that is part of how we recognize. I'm not sure if there's something else you wanted to add in.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Colleen. I've been saying the last while, and you don't have to agree with me, and this panel doesn't have to agree with me, but perhaps RPL has become a bit dated. It's quite expensive, and it's quite difficult. We've seen through a couple of international studies, including from the OECD, that RPL works, but normally more in a very specific, narrow environment, like a regulated environment, where you have to upskill on qualifications. But in terms of our national systems, it can be costly and difficult to implement. And perhaps if we have a system that is more interoperable, RPL can be done through digital means as opposed to a more formal process. But I'll leave that for you just to be a bit provocative and think about, and maybe we can come back to it. All right, Koen, can I put you on the spot a little bit? Can you talk about the digital aspect of microcredentials? Should all microcredentials be digital or not? And maybe if you can link that to digital identity, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. I would say that we need generally a transformation where this is possible, of course, because we have to, and I agree with Bodhan, we have to be aware of context. But in an ideal situation, you would move to digital formats for the way that you obtain the micro-credential. And then by this, I mean, so to say, the certificate. Yeah. So that is very important. And in a European context, what we are now looking at is not only to promote the digitalization of credentials, but also to link it to digital portfolios so that are linked to the digital identity of citizens. And there is European law about this. So every European should be able to obtain a citizen wallet, as it's called, digital citizen wallet. And that would contain not only, let's say, your learning credentials, but also other credentials, like your identity credentials, your passport, for example, your driving license, your health insurance, but also possibly your learning credentials. And we are discussing now with the service that is in charge of this. Related to that is the issue of who is issuing the micro-credential in that case. And when we talk about that citizen wallet, to issue digital credentials in that wallet, that can only be done by trusted providers. Yeah? And then the question is, okay, how do you determine that? So you could determine that, for example, through national qualifications frameworks. Then the question is, if you have that in relation to identity, do you really need it for all types and levels of micro-credentials? Yeah? Isn't it sufficient to do that for the macro-credentials, which gives you usually entitlements to further learning, for example? But if you do a micro-credential of, let's say, I don't know, a small number of credits, is it also essential there? What I think is, however, essential, and this is also the European approach on micro-credentials, is to protect somehow citizens, to make sure that when you embark upon learning for a micro-credential, that you really can trust also, that this micro-credential gives you value for money.
Okay.
So it's a bit of an issue of proportionality that we also need to include in that discussion.
Maybe just a follow-up, Kun, data privacy. So you have GDPR in Europe, and is digital identity fully compliant with GDPR? And, I'm assuming it is because that's what you're implementing. But maybe just give us some reflection on that. Are there any risks there?
You asked me a very difficult question, James, because I'm not a GDPR, a data protection specialist, but of course, in our work on digital credentials, GDPR and data privacy plays a huge, a very big role. And so you have to design systems, of course, that ensure that individuals really agree also to sharing of their data. So I think you need to, if you set up systems of digital credentialing, you really have to make a good design of data privacy. And it's true that in the European Union, and I think this is good, we have these requirements of the GDPR. At the same time, sometimes also people overstate a bit. So as soon as you come to personal identity, GDPR and nothing is possible. This is also, again, an issue of proportionality. So you should look for the opportunity, but of course within a broader context. And I would say a legal context from a European perspective seen. I mean, we think that this legal context is a good context, but it requires a lot of effort also in terms of monitoring.
Does anybody else want to come in on the data privacy point? Please feel free. We can keep this relatively flexible. Okay, if there's not anybody, I'll move on. If the question is not easy, maybe I don't want to put you on the spot, but Maureen, over to you.
Yeah, I think, the question on the data privacy is very important. The protection is also about the ownership of the data by the individuals that is critical. But again, there is a trade-off. If we don't have access to data, we will not be able to leverage the data. And there is almost a curve that the regulatory aspect has to go in a way. But at one point, the innovation and the leveraging is intersecting that. And that's where the innovation and the protection equation is very important. It's about human right, but it's also about the capacity to leverage and develop. So I think it requires some discussion, but obviously the protection, the privacy is central in terms of a human right. But I think it's important to think about the also how we can anonymize data, so that, and we have techniques for that, so that we are able to leverage the data that is available. And we have seen how much this can be very helpful for individuals, for learners, for communities, for societies and economies more broadly. Over to you.
Thanks, Maureen. I think that's a helpful answer. In the African and particularly Southern African context, this curve between, access to data to develop systems versus data privacy is a risky one, and one that is not often discussed. And I think if we talk micro-credentials, this has to be part of the conversation. Not that we have all the answers. All right, Isabel, if I can ask you a question, and I don't know you so well, so I can't give you a hard time like the others that I know well. So I'm giving you like an easy question, I hope. It's about the quality assurance of micro-credentials. So we've generally been talking about 3 levels. Self-attested. So, I say I've done a credential somewhere, but nobody has checked or quality assured it. And then a peer mechanism, maybe like LinkedIn, where somebody said, yeah, sure, you had that job and you did that course. And then the gold standard, which is the formal qualifications framework systems. Where do you think micro-credentials fit in? And do you have any views on these quality assurance levels?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I think that indeed micro-credentials are so diverse, and it's a term that, at least from the EU perspective definition, but I guess from any definition, is so broad, that is upon so many sectors and stakeholders, that we cannot have like one single way of go about quality assurance on micro-credentials. Like there is no such a thing of like one thing will fit it all, because then what you do is like to compromise on this flexibility and on this agility to respond to labor market demands of micro-credentials. So again, there is a little bit of this trade-off, right? So I can understand that, for example, for micro-credentials that are included in national qualification frameworks, or that I deliver by formal education and training institutions, such a vocational education and training center, or such a university, then the quality assurance mechanisms of those micro-credentials will pass more by these formal existing tools that already exist, right, in these instruments. But I don't know to what extent we want to impose such sometimes very, very cumbersome quality assurance instruments and mechanisms, for example, to a company that is issuing a micro-credential on a certain, imagine, like IT software, right? And for which the quality is assured via the trust of the stakeholders that then need to recognize it, right? And then the quality can be assured somehow else and is equally valid. So something where I will insist is that what is important for the EU approach is, for sure, to have quality assurance instruments wherever they are, and whatever doesn't mean that we lose on standards, but that we are flexible on what works for every sector and for every circumstance. But what is very, very important is that it is included as a standard element to describe the micro-credential, to be transparent on how on earth to have assured the quality of these micro-credentials, right? Like the definition said, the micro-credential needs to be underpinned by quality assurance, and you need to include, like, to be transparent about how did you do it, and to be descriptive about it. And this is a way in which we can be transparent and we can ease the understanding of the micro-credentials without being too rigid on the way to do it, and therefore being inclusive enough so that the world of micro-credentials can keep thriving, not being killed by very, very strict mechanisms that I understand are extremely important for example, formal education and training, but maybe it kills the beauty or like the potential of this tool for being agile to respond to societal and labor market needs. So there is a bit like the way to play around it, in my view.
Good.
Yeah.
I think that's a very diplomatic response, Isabel. When we started talking about lifelong learning in what is it, in the 60s, Boreen, the kind of UNESCO early reports, the Pura reports and so on, we started introducing this differentiation between formal, non-formal and informal learning. And the systems we have today are very much the formal systems, aren't they? And they quality assure well, and they do all the things that you spoke about, Isabel. But the reality is then we used RPL to try and get the formal and the non-formal to be like the formal. Do you see a risk when we talk about micro-credentials that we might, you used the word kill, we can use the right word. It's about, in a way, you take away the innovation by trying to make it so structured and so bureaucratic. Do you think there's a risk that the current debate on micro-credentials is going to be sucked into the formal system and we will lose the agility and the innovation that we have at the moment? Just from the countries you work in, is it something you're seeing happening or not?
Yeah, there is definitely a risk, but what I see is like, in a way, two different ways to go about them, right? Like one way is that you come from a formal education and training system that has these traditional long qualifications and want to step into this, in a way, market of adult learning, right? Of lifelong learning by being agile and flexible and shorter in the type of trainings that you deliver, and therefore more people will jump into your institution, right? Like this is one way to go about it. And then, for example, a risk or like the challenges of this sector is how relevant they are for society and for the labor market, and how successful they are in the uptake. So there is one way that has its sets of challenges, right? And the other thing that happens is maybe more on the labor market side. And here I'm talking from employment. That is that when an actor that has an interest on some skills to be developed, and they see that this is not being covered by formal education and training systems, they jump in and not waiting for any regulation. They set up a training, they cover in it, and if something, they certify it or they don't care. So there is where the public administration step in to say, hey, let's make sure that this is inclusive, that this is owned by the learner, that this is portable, that has quality, that other stakeholders can also understand it, so that the learner, after having received this training, can move around and be portable, right, with their skills. And so, but then it is not a problem that they are not relevant for the labor market, because they were born for covering a need that existed, right? So these two ways to go about it is a bit like let us talk about two different set of challenges. And I don't know if that a bit like answers or like hint about,
Look, there's a fluidity at the moment that I think none of us have the precise answers for. So this is about, where is the globe going? So we don't lose trust, because I think a couple of you spoke about trust this morning. In systems, because the risk here, and Nadia, the CEO of SACWA, is on the call, and Nadia and I often have this discussion, can we open the NQF to credentials? And Nadia can talk for herself if she's willing to. I can give her a chance now. But the risk is that if we open it too widely, it kind of like the public get all confused, because which of the credentials are quality assured and how, and all of a sudden they coexist on the same platform or the same ecosystem. And that creates a risk for us, Isabel. So sorry for asking you a difficult question without knowing you so well, but that was a good response. Okay, just shifting a little bit to regional developments. Boreen, you work a lot globally and regionally. Do you agree or believe that regional policies and guidelines for microcredentials are necessary?
Thank you, James. And I know that also Nicholas may come in, because the HACO is doing important work at the continental level in this context. Just a few words on what you asked, Isabel, and then I come to your question, James, if you allow me. I think we are in a situation of influx, as you are mentioning, and I'm very happy to see that in addition to countries' system who are trying to give more visibility to microcredentials, their qualification framework or national qualification framework, we see that civil society, for example, is engaging in and leveraging the microcredential notion and perspective and vision and purpose and function to serve population that didn't benefit from learning opportunities, that employers are also leveraging their potential. So I think we are in that fluidity, and the scenario probably will be something in between, where system will continue having I would say a framework and quality assurance, but there are also needs that will have to be responded to, and microcredential will do that. Now, on your question, James, I think I do believe on the context and the importance of communities, national, regional, and global. And I think important aspect regarding the regional economic communities is that there is a policy objective of economic integration, of mobility, of collaboration and cooperation. I think that's a very important driver for having common agendas, having common tools, common framework. We see that in the European Commission, but we see that also in ASEAN, we see that in the Pacific region, we see that in the Caribbean, and in other regions, and of course, what the Commonwealth colleagues are doing. So we see these dimensions are important aspect, and I think the drivers might be, in that case, different across the different tiers, I would say. But there is something that we need to take into account, and it would be interesting in terms of analysis, and UNESCO and other maybe international organizations can take that for, is that jobs move, and you can work from Joburg, where you are, eventually for a company in Paris, where I am. So the credentials also move. You can learn from in Paris a Coursera course which is in US. So I think that fluidity of learning, of credentials, of jobs is a factor that we need to include in our thinking in the system building. And that's why international, regional, and international agreements, dialogue, collaboration, knowledge sharing, peer learning are critical. Otherwise, we will have tensions, and that's not what at least an organization like UNESCO is acting for. It's about multilateralism, it's about respect, it's about cooperation and solidarity. Over to you.
Thank you, Maureen. I think you've covered it well. So, Nicholas, let's turn to you. If you can tell us about HAQUA and your views on, regional policies, guidelines, continental instruments, and maybe go all the way to tuning. Tuning functioned, if I'm not mistaken, at a curriculum level. So one of the things, I would want to reflect, if you can reflect with us, what have you learned from tuning that you've taken into microcredentials, and how does that relate to learning outcomes? So I'm slipping in a bit of two questions, if you're okay to take both, Nicholas.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me first try to clarify one point. Tuning is not operating anymore as a project in the region. Basically, all the discussions about the African credit transfer system has been taken up by HAQUA. I just want to make this clear from the very beginning. Now, regarding the discussion of regional policies and mechanisms, I tend to agree with Borrell in the sense that it is actually very important to try to generate bridges between the different, in the case of Africa, sub-regions in order to try to find readability. I don't know how to say this in English. Make the systems readable among them. You all know that Africa is very heterogeneous and diverse, so this is in itself a problem, and it is a problem or a complex process when it comes to formal credentials, to formal education. Now, if you add the layer of the plurality of micro-credentials, the problem can, or the complexity of the situation can be broadened. What are we doing in HAQUA? HAQUA is mainly looking at formal systems or traditional systems. I think it's a false dichotomy at the end of the day. Formal and informal, or formal and non-traditional system, at the end of the day, are learning mechanisms, that should have, and at the center of all this debate is a question of trust. And this is basically what we are trying to do in HAQUA. Build mechanisms, build discussions, build policies that put trust at the center and make system trustful among each other. this might have an impact in enhancing mobility, thus in enhancing, someone said jobs move, well, people have to move as well. And credentials should be readable among the regions. Either these credentials are issued by traditional institutions or by non-traditional institutions. I think the risk at the end of the day of dividing the discussion between quality assurance mechanisms for traditional learning credentials, at the end of the day, a degree is a credential, or if when you make all the work that UNI has done regarding credits is trying to show that a credential is composed with certain number of credits that represent certain learning outcomes, so or hours of learning. So at the end of the day, a macro credential is built up by, let's say, a group of micro credentials, no? So I do not tend to agree with Isabel in the sense to make this division so harsh between traditional bureaucratic mechanism of quality assurance and, let's say, more flexible, innovative quality assurance. I think at the end of the day, whatever the discussion or whatever the tool is, should be around building up trustful systems in each region and each country that can take, let's say, accountability or make the whole credential system transparent for actors, both at the academic and at the private level. In
Okay.
HAQUA, we are focusing on this, and we are trying to promote, and we do this on behalf of the European Commission as well, no? To promote this idea in different policy discussions in each of the African countries, in particular when it comes to the African credit transfer system for formal education. It's important that every government buys it in. It's not something that an institution can do alone. So I agree with Borem in the sense of we need to look at the problem from the perspective of the institution, of the region, of the government, and at the end of the day, of the continent. And I meet the African Union Commission in this discussion as well.
Mm. And just to protect Isabel, she didn't say it. I kind of insinuated she responded. I agree with you on the artificialness of the categories, you know, the non-formal, formal, informal. You're right, Nicholas. The problem is, I suppose, that our systems are designed for that structure. And so, you know, in a way, we're going to move beyond that, hopefully soon. Jaco, can I bring you in here? We spoke just now about Cole's move around. I think you mentioned it's like a credit transfer system for microcredentials. Tell us a little bit more about that, and how does it relate to the conversation we've been having now?
Yes, thank you very much. What we are planning at Cole, and it's not something that is running yet, is actually a framework that will cover the whole Commonwealth, that will be inclusive, that will cover what has been done already. We've got some excellent practices that we can draw from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, many places, but also in places where this is emerging, like the work that you're doing in Southern Africa, and kind of have a framework that allows for that recognition to be done within that wider sphere. And I think that links to what you just said in terms of regional policies and strategies. I think what we're doing here is to an extent that many of our partner governments cannot afford the best platforms and registries. So we have to combine resources, and that's when we talk about scalability and benefiting from the affordance of portability between countries, then we have to collaborate. Then countries have to collaborate. And as noted before, it's happening in the Caribbean, it's being considered in the Pacific. And we hope that our framework will be of support there, because only if you have these kind of bigger structures, you don't have pockets around the world reinventing the wheel. You can ensure standardization. You can enhance credit transfer. You know, you can boost that trust that employers will have in terms of credentials, and also encourage collaboration. I think within this space, there's a lot of potential. As much as standards and collaboration is very strong when it comes to digital identities, when it comes to microcredentials, we believe the same kind of things, but in many places, take for example the metadata of a microcredential. There are so many approaches to that. There's no standard yet. There's no worldwide standard that everyone can say, yes, this is what we'll do. In Europe, it's easy for them. They've got legislation. They say all the countries must use X and they use it. In Canada, it's done at provincial level, so not even national. So British Columbia will use Y, Alberta will use R, and so it goes on. So it's very tricky if you don't have a broader approach, and I think that is what we aim with the framework, but with the caveat that it needs to be very inclusive and it needs to be the Commonwealth's framework, not the Commonwealth of Learning's framework, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, that's clear. So, Koen, let me move to you. So, firstly, I'm sure all European member states comply without any complaints. I think, Jaco just said there's a consistency. I'm sure that there are a lot of robust debates around the things that you do. But can you just build on that a little bit and give us a sense, when we started with NQFs, we used the acronym, it's not a quick fix. Is a micro-credential another quick fix? Do you think, looking at your work in Europe, are micro-credentials like just taking over that narrative of an easy solution to a difficult problem? So, yeah, you don't have to answer my first point, maybe just more my second question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, James. I think nothing is a quick fix. Yeah. Maybe if you have an IT system, you discover a small thing that needs to be repaired, that you can call a quick fix. But I think micro-credentials are not a quick fix. Just, Jack, one little point I wanted to make. It's true, in Europe, we have indeed a European approach and commonalities, but they are not, let's say, formal in law, but they take the form of recommendations, but they have been negotiated by the member states. So there is a joint commitment, I would say. But because we are still in the voluntary sphere, we don't have instruments for, bringing countries to court and if they don't do something. But I think little by little we have this joint approach, and also seeing that in the global situation, that, as Europe, okay, we have to collaborate and we have to work, together more perhaps than we did in the past. But we, of course, still do have 27 education systems and even more, because some countries have also, especially those who are federal, have also, like in Canada, the regional, and also in Spain, I think the regions have a say in education, and in Germany certainly as well. Micro-credentials are not a quick fix. National qualifications framework, we see now after 20 years that, or almost 20 years of EQF, that we have around, I think, a bit more than 20 out of the 37 countries that have reference to the EQF. So they are more than just the member states, but a bit more than 20 are now moving towards operational qualifications frameworks. So these are processes that simply take time. I think there is a tendency now that countries that have developed a framework and that have an operational framework, that they set this a bit more institutionally. So it's getting closer linked to education policies. More and more countries also adopt frameworks by law, but this is more like, what I can see, a bit more bottom up than just top down. What we do see is, because we're talking here about micro-credentials, of course, but we have a longer tendency already of quite a few countries that are including qualifications that are not from the formal education system. There again, we have the definition, but to include these in national frameworks, because national frameworks, of course, need to be trusted, but also they need to be relevant. If they are not relevant, they need to be relevant for the learner, but also for their long term, they need to be relevant for the education system, but also for the labor market, because it doesn't make so much sense perhaps to have that. Can I mention just one point of information? Is that we are also now redrafting the ECTS user guide. So that's the European Credit Transfer System. So that's the topic that Jaak was talking about. This is now also redrafted, and in the current context of digitalization and micro-credentials. So those elements will be taken up there. I don't know whether I replied really well to your question, James, but
No, it's a fair reply, Kun, and we're all dealing with the complexities of policy development in our countries and regions, and it's not easy. All right, Pauline. One of the criticisms we often face around microcredentials or smaller units of learning is that they cannot be put together as a integrated whole that has a logic of a qualification. So people criticize these smaller parts as a smorgasbord of putting a whole lot of smaller modules, unit standards, smaller parts together, and then they become a whole qualification that has no internal logic. Do you have a view on this?
Thank you for that question, James, for that very complex question. Well, we already have the system. I think it's already working. If I'm in the occupational qualification space and I only need like a specific part, I don't want to do the whole qualification. I'm only going to use that. Then I think the micro-credentials in the NQF space, I think that already has an internal logic. And I mean, and nothing is perfect. And in our trades and qualification and occupational space, they are continuously reviewing and looking at all of that. So I don't think the internal logic, when it's related to a qualification or the micro-credentials in the NQF space. So I'm going to separate that because I think that answers that question. But the micro-credentials that are not in the NQF space, I think in terms of stackability, I can't answer that question. And I also wonder, why are we so, is qualification where we want to be? Are we, is there nothing else besides bringing it into the NQF space? Do we want to bring all micro-credentials? Is it only going to have value when we compare to something on the NQF? I just think that we are like overly, I don't know what you could, preoccupied with bringing micro-credential in the NQF space or comparing it to a qualification or breaking it down into parts of qualifications when the micro-credentials ecosystem is so wide. So I hope I've answered that question. So we've got the national micro-credentials which have an internal logic, and then those outside of the NQF space, which I feel it does not need to look like a qualification, or actually, we need to maybe say that it still has value. Just a last point, when somebody comes in, I'm putting on my foreign qualifications hat now. When somebody comes in with a foreign qualification, and then we've evaluated that qualification at a specific NQF level, then the person says, but I also have training. Say, for instance, I'm just saying hypothetically, I also have training with the Bill Gates Foundation. That person wants to use that credential for more money or for more recognition. And I think that is where you need to look at. So what is the purpose of a micro-credential? Is it to get you into university? Is it to get you into further learning? Is it to get you into another job? Or is it to get you more money? So all of those things, like what is the purpose of the micro-credential? So so when you look at internal logic, you also need to look at what is it serving?
Thanks, Colleen. So my one takeaway from your response, in part, because I think you said a lot of useful things, is that we will have micro-credentials potentially in NQFs, but also micro-credentials that are outside. And that's probably one of the lines that we need to be very clear about as people that work with national systems, national policies. Micro-credentials are actually challenging that very idea that that all learning matters. And Nicholas, to your point, that these divides, formal, non-formal, are dissipating. I don't know, Nicholas, do you want to respond to this point? Do you have a strong view? Do you think we will have micro-credentials in systems and outside, or do you think they will converge?
Oh, probably the division exists. I am just trying to argue about the problem of this. The division exists. My point is that when it comes to the recognition of the quality of those credentials, there are already systems in place that can be used, or we should try not to divide. I'm sorry, Isabel, I didn't want to be, let's say, against your argument, but it seems to be that it seemed to me that the suggestion was, okay, we have a very strict bureaucratic approach to quality in formal education, and let's say a super flexible, innovative approach to the credentials coming from non-formal education. And I think that shouldn't be like that. We should be able to converge at some point in some capacity to, let's say, make those credentials, whatever they are, transparent, even if either if they are taken, because at the end of the day, it's the quality of the learning that matters, not the objective of the learner. So even if the learner wants to take a small course on, let's say, Spanish with me, or I assume Isabel, to make more money in the Spanish market, what matters is the quality and the transparency of that credential, the credibility of that credential. And in such a complex systems, Kuhn make a very good point about the incapacity of the European Commission to order the countries what to do. It's a It's a bottom-up approach that matters. So some sort of agreement or the promotion of that agreement is what I feel we should be, let's say, pushing for.
All right, thank you. Maureen, can I take Isabel first? I think she can respond to this and I'll come to you if it's okay. Isabel.
I'm fine with going later, if not, but
You can go. Go for it.
okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I think we are not that distant on our way to look at that, but like maybe for the sake of putting some fire in the discussion, right? It is like, let's think of the logic of like how micro-credentials appear, right? We always insist on the narrative is like, it's not that we came here to invent them as a solution, is that they grow on themselves as a solution, right? Like there was something to solve, that is that the capacity to respond of formal education and training systems to the societal and labor market needs was limited because it was less agile, maybe too bureaucratic to fix and whatnot. So somehow micro-credentials started to grow exponentially, above all during COVID time years and so, but also before, but like exponentially then. And then us, like public administration, right, step in to put some order so that we understand this whole world that has grown on its own. So this on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden, all the work done and all the rationale for organizing formal education and training systems is not useful anymore, or traditional qualifications are not useful anymore. So we insist very much on that micro-credentials are complementary to traditional qualifications, so to speak, because there is very reasons why qualifications are nicely regulated. There is heavy instruments for quality assurance. They give you a foundational knowledge that probably those micro-credentials cannot give you, right? So micro-credentials are definitely useful. It's not us who said they are useful. It's society and the market who said they are. You know, they grow despite us. So they are definitely needed, and we are working towards for them to be more understood, more easily compared, right? Like more organized and whatnot. But still, I think it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we need to completely neglect the usefulness of the whole system in place around longer traditional qualifications that give you a set of like critical thinking skills, of foundational knowledge that you cannot achieve with this fast pace, right? So really like look at them in a complementary way, like as micro-credentials topping up skills that you need, or maybe easy in the access then to education and training. And so that's a way I propose to look at them.
Thanks, Isabel. I have a few people that will have coffee with you and agree 100% with you. So thank you for that. So just process-wise, I'm seeing some comments around Q&A. What I'm going to do is we're not going to get through all the questions. This is a healthy debate, but we don't have to answer all the questions. So I'm going to finish this topic and then we can start opening up for questions. You can post them in the chat, but we will also give you a chance to unmute. We'll just watch our time. So let me just finish this conversation and then we'll do that. Maureen.
Yeah, thank you. I will be very short because I know that we would like also colleagues to come in. There is something that we didn't speak about from my point of view is the financing. Money talks, and the policies of financing will determine also how far where microcredentials will go. In some countries, I mean, Jaco mentioned British Columbia, we see it in France, we see it in Singapore, increasingly in Europe. The learning, the lifelong learning entitlement or form of learning entitlement are a way for supporting micro-credentials, supporting learning for different purposes. And it echoes a bit the discussion between Nicholas and Isabel, because you can learn for self-fulfillment and you can learn for other objectives than for the labor market. So it's very important. But the financing will matter because in Australia, you have a learning entitlement that helps you get a first level of qualifications. So if the government of Australia changes the policy and says, I'm funding only micro-credentials, then the market might follow. So I think the financing will determine also how far, how much, and where the micro-credential landscape will go. Is it funding initial training and people who are entering the labor market? That's the case of Africa with a high level of youth, unemployment and demography that is growing. In a context like Europe, but even, more, I would say, a different situation in Japan or in Korea, you have senior persons and you like them to keep them in life and learning for life and not necessarily learning for job. So I think financing is an important policy lever that we'll have to watch very closely, because that will determine also how micro-credential will evolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Bureen. I was going to skip that one and I shouldn't have, because I think you're quite right. Even, in SADC, in particular Africa, that's an even more important point that you make, because governments can be persuaded to adopt systems and processes, that they need to pay for, which should actually be free. And so in many cases, the work that many of you do, including Cole, helps countries like this to better understand rather complex things like digital identity and others, and that these things don't always have to be commercialized. But, that's a personal point of view, and I'm sure we can talk more about it. Nicholas.
No, just a quick comment. I was not criticizing the useful of micro-credential. I was trying to mention that quality assurance mechanism should be there, and that we have been discussing about quality assurance mechanism at the national and continental level everywhere for many, many years. And the central aspect of this discussion is trust. So the question would be how to build a trustful and readable system for micro-credential that can take or not some of the elements that exist in traditional formal education quality assurance system for the micro-credential. I understand that if you're in a field where mushrooms are growing like this, it is complicated, but we should think with calm in order to answer complex question, I think, and do not put traditional education and micro-credential in a confrontal manner, because many universities also offer micro-credentials and are transforming. So there is a paradigm change that we need at least to have in mind when discussing specific elements in these debates.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. This group knows each other quite well, so we've had many robust debates, Nicholas. It is quite healthy and good to challenge and not agree and to have debates, so absolutely welcome. So I'm going to start preparing for taking questions, and as we do that, you can either put your hand up and I will take in the room as well, but I just want to give the panel a chance to answer one last question, just a brief question each. So the question is, will, in your view, we still have micro-credentials in 2030? So looking 5 years ahead, do you think it's just a fad, a trend, or do you think we will still have micro-credentials in, 5 to 10 years? And I'll just quickly go around. Isabel, do you want to start?
Yes, a firm yes. That's a bit the idea, right? Like if we want to boost and to create this mindset of lifelong learning, it is clear that this cannot go through like long trainings and stuff like this, because you need to make it compatible with your life, right? So I guess that well, the two parts of the micro-credential word are important, right? That it is a credential so that you can certify it, but also that is micro. This is a very important thing, that like the way you top up on your skills all throughout your life is via these small chunks, but like every year in training. Like I remember this goal of the EU of like 60% of adults in training every year. And then that's how you keep the statistics, right? Yep.
All right, Jaco, how about you? And I'm sorry, we tried to give you some extra sleep, but I failed badly. Yes.
No worries. No, short answer, definitely. We will definitely have something along the lines of micro-credentials in 5 years. Whether we'll call it still micro-credentials or maybe something else, that's another issue. But I think the need and the use of micro-credentials within industry is clear. You know, the certification from Google or IBM is very valuable in certain areas. What universities are doing will definitely be on the radar of qualifications authorities, you know, students, all the stakeholders. You know, the issue of unbundling within higher education, and higher education is in a very difficult situation worldwide right now. So we will have to consider this, and it's got financial implications. Many institutions will have to adopt this kind of approach to broaden what they can service and what they can do. So I think 5 years definitely. How far it will extend will depend on the commitment from governments and also the development around identity wallets. If that is mainstream, then definitely further. Thank you.
You and I can have a coffee about that, Jaco. Colleen?
Yes, I definitely agree that we will still have micro-credentials. And we've had micro-credentials for the past, I don't know how many years. Before we started recording the first training, I'm sure there was already training happening and we called it something different. And I'm quite surprised that James didn't ask the question, will qualifications become obsolete in the next 5 years? He's asked that before and I said, no, I don't think qualifications will ever become obsolete, because even now when we're talking about micro-credential, we are looking through a lens of what is on the macro level. So definitely I think we will still have it. And I agree with the previous speaker, maybe we'll call it some other Harry Potter word, that, and then people are going to say, no, we don't have that. But we do have it, whether it's called a kettle or a pot, we will have it in the next 5 years.
Thanks, Colleen. I was not allowed to ask that question, so I had it on my list, but it was removed. Nicholas?
Yes, I think micro-credentials are going to be there by themselves, and also as a way to challenge traditional format of education. I think that's the main challenge national system will have, how to work with together with the institutions to help them to transform themselves. There are many discussions in the South African context. I know in Stellenbosch University, for example, some discussions about modularization of education exist. I think this is the way where the whole discussion will be looking at in 5 years' time.
Thank you, Nicholas. Koen?
Yeah, thank you, James. I had a bit more time to think about this. So my answer is also yes, because we have societal transformations of economy that really require micro-credentials as a way of flexible learning, but also to make skills more visible. So I would really definitively integrate also the non-formal and informal learning part there. Now, what is important, and we didn't so much talk about this, we talked about financial aspects, financial accessibility, that's crucial, okay, learning accounts, but what is also crucial is that learners have access to information on micro-credentials they can trust, and then also, where needed, good guidance is available to help learners navigate in the increasing complex landscape of learning opportunities that will be there, including micro-credentials.
That's a really important point to end with, I agree. Boreen.
Thank you, James. I would like to refer to what Colleen asked. I think the question is not about would we have a micro-credential, but within which framework we would have, and obviously how that fits with the national qualification framework. I think what Jaco mentioned, but also Koen earlier in the other discussion, is that probably micro-credential will be part of a broader learner records portfolio or system where it interacts with other tools and other resources. And it can be even more advanced. What Koen was referring, it can be rather your social records, which is not only learning, but it can be social protection, etc. That will depend, of course, on maybe not 2030, but probably that's something that we see. And with the more technology, we will be more able to ensure that it is part of a system and interacting and interoperable. So I see it as part of a system perspective rather than just as a separate instrument. Over to you.
Thank you, Boreen. All right, let's open for a couple of questions and conversation. I think, Frederick, you were first. You're welcome to unmute. Please direct your question to somebody specific if you can.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you all for a very interesting morning with very interesting speakers and excellent sharing. I'm afraid I will not direct the question to one specific because it's really something that came across many of the interventions that I heard this morning. But I will start from a thing I really liked about Colleen's contribution when she was referring to credits and qualification frameworks and accreditation as a kind of protected terms. And there was also this reference to tuning, in which I was personally involved already 25 years ago. And I think what we did there was, among other things, give content and to these protected terms and concrete tools to higher education institutions to work with that. So my point or my question is, should we hence not try to look at micro-credentials also as a kind of protected term, which means that in Europe, at least from my perspective, and this is also what the European Commission's recommendation has triggered, it rules out micro-credentials that are only partially or not in the NQF space, as Colleen called it. And so for me, this is the strength of such a regional or even a more globally agreed upon take on micro-credentials, that we include a number of these trust-building elements in it. Otherwise, I think it decreases its value a lot. And trust is a word that I heard a lot this morning, and I think it's a crucial element in this debate. And by the way, for me, this does not disqualify the value of informal and non-formal learning. On the contrary, I think it stresses the specificity, the specific values of these types of learning as compared to other types of learning. So thank you for your take on my question there.
Thank you, Frederick. I'm going to take a couple of questions and then the panel can respond. Shirley in the room.
Thank you very much. Mine is, I suppose, a comment question, but I think something that Boreen spoke about was the issue of context is very important. And I've just jotted down here, and Colleen also referred to purpose. So purpose and context of where micro-credentials happen. And I'd like to suggest that it's not only embedded within NQF qualifications per se, and I'll give a very brief example. If you take some sectors, for example, sport is global. You can't put it in a South African NQF or a Namibian one or even whatever. It's global and it's driven by global federations. So, for example, micro-credentialing becomes a hugely important issue, not necessarily located in an NQF, but you take the World Anti-Doping, you take safety in sport, you take gender-based violence issues, all of those which are essential. First aid. In South Africa now, every single coach on the sports field needs to do a form of first aid. There isn't a first aid qualification per se. It could be a micro-credential. So the context there is outside of formal. It's more in a professional development space. But also, just to pick up with what Colleen said, in the Financial Advisors and Intermediary Services Act 2002, where every single person working in financial services had to have certain number of what we called credits or credentials per year to eventually be able to get the qualification. And they needed those micro-credentials, stroke whatever, in order to continue working. So there was a huge move there, and those were underpinned by recognition of prior learning, and that's another day's discussion there. So again, the context was industry-driven, legislatively driven. Purpose, context, whether it's in a formal space, whether it's an industry requirement for better professional development, whether it's in a global space like sport or performing arts, the context and the purpose. And micro-credentials, in my opinion, in a developing country, being a South African, has to be pro-poor. Because for some people, they were excluded. So inclusivity, pro-poor have to top our agenda. Maybe it's the first step on a ladder for people to get into some form of learning, some form of skill to give them a job. So there are a lot of issues around micro-credentials, certainly in our context. Thank you very much.
So maybe my challenge to you, Shirley, would be, or for all of us, is, if qualifications were bound by countries and they need things like Colleen spoke about, comparisons and NARICs of this world, can credentials challenge that mindset that credentials are not bound to countries, but credentials actually, from the original conceptualization are cross boundaries, or things that can move between countries and don't need those complexities to be compared with each other. Okay, let's take one or two other comments. I don't see anybody online, perhaps. I know who the culprits online are, so I can try them. All right, let's try just one in the room, Britta.
It's actually online as well. I'm just reading it out. It's from Kistama Reddy. What does the National Qualifications Framework as a relational construct or a framework, relational framework, mean for this conversation?
Okay, let's give Julie a chance. Julie, do you just want to talk to your question? She's still with us. Okay, not a problem. We got the question. So it's this idea of a relational device. So this is a little bit of old NQF history, where an NQF is seen not only as a bureaucratic technical instrument, but as a social construct. And we can have a long discussion, a whole kind of 2-day seminar about that. But maybe just if anybody wants to pick that up, they're welcome. Okay, anybody else in the room? Jessica?
I'll put this on. I just have to say thank you to all of the panelists at the moment. My brain has been running on speed drive as I listen to each and every one of you, bringing your thoughts from the idea of, one of the first things that immediately made me go, whoa, was this focus on the digital of the micro-credential, especially in our space where we have this digital divide. And you have another term, alternative digital credentials, which has been out there in spaces like EDUCAURS, Horizon Reports, that type of thing. So in what way would we then differentiate between a micro-credential and an alternative digital credential and badging and so on? So what's clear to me is we actually, like you said in your discussion, really need to map what every single one of these things mean, because it is a jungle out there. So we need to create the ecosystem to be able to map it. And then I thought to myself, the formal, the informal, the non-formal learning, that doesn't take place in the digital space, not always. So how are we going to give them the bicycle, so to speak, instead of the Ferrari? And I've been writing notes for myself on my laptop, on my phone, because it's all over the place. But I would love to hear your thoughts here, because I know there are arguments for and against outcomes, learning outcomes, outcomes-based education. There's been a lot of debate around there. But if there's one thing that all of this shares, whether it's NQFs, qualifications, part qualifications, micro-credentials, and so on, is the outcomes, the learning outcomes, the evidence of the learning outcomes. Would it be possible to build almost like a system of what are the outcomes? We have exit level outcomes. What are the exit level outcomes in this qualification? Within a qualification, you have modules. What are the specific outcomes of those modules? Which NQF are they being mapped to? Because then you have these bite-sized micro-credentials that will also have outcomes. Could we help if the learner wants to, and I'm going to come back there, could we help them if they decide that they want this recognized to get into the system by an outcomes mapping rather than mapping credentials, so to speak? And then last thought, we need to speak to the learners because we're putting out these thoughts up here, but let's go to the learners, the lifelong learners, people who identify as lifelong learners, and ask them what they would like to see. What is their vision? Because I'm picking up a job-focused discussion, labor market and jobs, where in South Africa, the push is towards entrepreneurship and building an economy. So how would this service an entrepreneur? And that's me.
Okay, some big comments. If we can codify all learning, using learning outcomes and perhaps using domains like knowledge, skills, and competencies, and we use a common nomenclature, surely as a global community, we can have better interoperability across all these learning outcomes using digital systems built on digital identities. That will protect the learners, that allow the interoperability. But the difficulty around a system like that is the quality assurance and the trust, because it's not so easy. We saw today that that's not such an easy answer to answer. All right, colleagues, we're slightly out of time. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to give the panel one last comment, whatever is top of mind that you want to leave the group with, and I'll start in reverse. So, Maureen, do you want to go first?
Oh my God, James. First, let me greet all colleagues, and I hear names, and I really, colleagues whom I appreciate, and I had a really great opportunities to learn and to work with them. So thank you, and thanks to all colleagues. I think the last intervention is very important. Let me put a provocative scenario. I think the challenge for all of us will be the human agency. And if we take the artificial intelligence growth, probably we'll be speaking about us and our co-pilot, agent, etc. So that human person interaction will be something that will determine as well the way we learn and the way we recognize learning, the way we are able to validate and assess learning. So I think if I'm provoking, I will say that we need to revisit and rethink the future of learning, and that will determine eventually how we will recognize, how we'll validate, how we'll assess, and how societies will value learning and learning outcomes. So I'm trying to provoke, but I think it's a way also to think a bit ahead. What would this mean for us as a human, and how we keep our humanity in a situation where we will have to interact with machine, and the machine person's interaction will be determining the way we engage socially, economically, etc. Over to you.
That's good. Good you didn't have time to think, Maureen, because that was a very good response. We've just recently finished some work for 2 UN agencies, and we pushed the boundaries a little bit to think about credentials can belong to machines as well. The reality is a machine can also have a credential. And so when you talk about the human element, Maureen, here, you're being provocative, but it is a reality. It is a reality that credentials can exist, across both humans and machines, and it can get quite complex for us in the future. Kun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for also the questions by participants, and also greetings from Brussels. One element that I would like to bring in here is that the technology of digital credentials does, of course, allow more than if you work with paper certification to have much more information in credentials. And then we talk about, in particular, learning outcomes, but also related skills. So that means that, for example, skills taxonomies could become more important and play a bigger role, and also linking digital credentials to particular skills, especially if they consist of structured data, can also help the labor market in a better matching, so to say. So this would be my take there. I wanted to contribute to that, of course. And it's always good to be with Borgen, of course, in a panel, because he's always provoking you. And in other territory, yeah, it's very difficult to now to predict what will happen, I think, with AI. So this is something we need to keep aware of. And last point, the relevance or the existence of qualification. Okay, nothing is given. I think that is a point that I wanted to make, and probably you agree with that, James. I hope.
Thanks, Quinn. I do agree with your point on skills taxonomies. I think there's something there that provides the foundation for interoperability that we're not dealing with as a collective enough. Nicholas?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thanking you all for having Aureal here in this panel. It was a very nice discussion. One small last reflection. I think there are two types of debate here on the table. One regarding on the mechanisms of guaranteeing the quality and readability and transparency of a credential. This is one very relevant practical discussion. There is another one, which is what Morenz, I think, put on the table, which is about the skills and the type of role learning will have in the future. I think the more, I have one defect in my life, I studied classical philosophy. So I think some of the answers that Morenz question posed are already somehow answered in classical tradition. Is we need to try to come back to the notion of learning and questioning and critical question, while of course all the formalities are important in order to guarantee transparency. But this capacity of human beings to be critical and question reality is coming more and more a relevant issue that we people working in education need to take into consideration, and we will need to take into consideration more seriously in the coming years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. Colleen?
There were so many issues that came out of all the questions, but I'm going to focus on something that it's my love and my passion is the learning outcomes aspect. So because in my presentation, I talk a lot about what is in the NQF space and what is not in the NQF space. So micro-credentials, I think in the NQF space, those learning outcomes, if you tell me level 3, I want to see the whole framework. I want to see what is, because at the uppermost level, it's your innovative work, you're creating something new. At the lower levels, it's like identify and so on. But, but outside of that space, when someone said about, what about like entrepreneurial thing, if somebody's unemployed and I'm going to do a course with them, for example, showing them how to write a business plan, taking them through Excel, if they want to have employees, how to kind of manage that. There's no NQF level attached to that. So the learning outcome will be specific to that activity. So even with the learning outcomes, if there is no NQF which cascades from your exit level and down to your learning outcomes for specific subjects, outside of that environment, we also need to have maybe a kind of conceptualization of how we are going to structure that learning outcome.
Thanks, Colleen. How about if Gen AI can help us with that structuring, Colleen? It's definitely an idea I'm playing with, but in any case, Jaco.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity and this very interesting and informative discussion, and greetings from Vancouver. I'd like to emphasize the importance of terminology. It was mentioned towards the end. And I think the idea of protecting microcredentials as a term, with my applied linguistics hat on, I would say yes, stick to one term and let's decide and let's just keep to that. But with my diplomatic hat on, no, we cannot. We have to accommodate different conceptualizations of this term. There's already traditions in terms of microcredentials, drawing on the whole badges idea and so on. So yes, it's a tricky one, but we have to talk about the terminology. And I'd like to close. I mentioned before, we are talking about micro-credentials the whole time. So it's still that issue of having a key without a lock. So we've got a solution for something. So there's a definite need for an inclusive and consultative process with inputs. And as was mentioned by the last person who posed the question, starting with students, lecturers, managers, institutions, qualifications and quality assurance agency, and definitely also industry. They must all be consulted to have, all stakeholders at the table when we talk about micro-credentials, because it's not just an issue of breaking down a little bit of learning at universities. It's a lot broader than that. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jaco, and thanks for wearing your diplomatic hat as well. I wanted to say that, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't. Isabel, you had the most time, so let's hear from you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so maybe I would like to elaborate about 2 points that were raised in the questions. Maybe the first one on the first question that has to do with like whether we should protect that, to what extent we should protect the term micro-credential, right? For the sake of like having a common discussion and whatnot. So I think that here it depends very much on what is your goal with micro-credentials or what is our goal with micro-credentials. Whether it is to facilitate or like to boost lifelong learning, right? Like to boost the possibility, to enhance the possibility of people to access learning in these short forms. And therefore, we don't care how they learn. We only want that we learn, right? That we are the whole life upskilling and reskilling. But we don't care much about how can we demonstrate this, right? Like we trust that this learning, however it happens, it can be demonstrated. Or whether our goal with micro-credentials is to set up a setting, like a system, through which we can go upfront with our skills and said to the world, hey, I do own this skill. I acquire it this way or this way, but the most important thing is that I got this learning outcome. And depends on what is our goal as policymakers, we will focus more on regulating, on protecting this term, or on like letting it free enough so that learning happen in whatever shape. From the EU perspective, I can say that it is a trade-off. It is how to say, like a dynamic equilibrium that we play with, right? Because if it would be only like the certification of the skills, we would go super harsh on our definitions, on what do you need to include, what not. But that's also not the case, right? Like we want learning to happen anyhow. And there are like all these innovations and however you want to call it, right? Like informal learning, non-formal, whatever. And most of the learning in adult life happens like in working settings, in life, through a migration experience. For example, it can be endless ways, like through, for example, parenthood. So this is also learning, right? What are we talking about? Like creating a system that can demonstrate these small doses of learning, and how rigid do you want to be with that? And this leads me to my second point that is very related, that it was also raised in the audience, that is the notion of inclusivity, right? Of inclusion, and like how does these micro-credentials relate to that? So it is, again, what do we want to do with micro-credentials? And I think both of my points are compatible. It's not either or. Like to easy access to learning opportunities, to education and training, for example, by making them learner-centered, targeted, flexible, relevant, and whatnot, right? And maybe exactly because of this flexibility, there is a way or a potential for being more inclusive in learning than what traditional formal education and training systems are. While, of course, aiming at keeping those traditional education and formal systems every time more inclusive. But okay, there is something in the nature of micro-credentials that make them more inclusive. But there is also another dimension for social inclusion with micro-credentials that has to do with acknowledgement of skills, with recognition of skills, with the system saying to each of us that there is something we have, we own, and we can demonstrate, and that has a value in society and in the market.
Thanks.
So I think that this part is also key of micro-credentials.
Next time you're going first, Isabel, not last. Thank you to the panel. I'm sure we're going to see each other somewhere on some panel, and then you're going to give me a hard time back because I had a chance today to give you all a hard time. So thank you so much. This was a really good experience and I learned a lot from it. I'm going to give back to the moderator. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel, but can we please all give James a hand for having done an excellent job? Thank you. Thanks. We running a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try and speed it up a bit. Whilst we are, or just before I hand over to Cindy, can I just ask everybody who's online to switch on their cameras because Ntokozo wants to take a photo. And then when we close, can I please ask the panel to not immediately log out, but to stay so that we can also take a photo with the participants that are in the room against the screen so that you're part of that photo. So whilst I'm talking, can we please get everybody in the room in the online room to turn on their camera? So we're coming to what is this called the summary and way forward, and it was meant to be Ms. Nadia Starr from SACO, but she's not feeling well. So she has asked Nolusindiso Kai to come and do it on her behalf. So Cindy, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Britta, and thanks, colleagues. I won't be long. I won't keep you here for longer than 5 minutes. I think what came out, or common points from all interventions today, was that the concept is not really new, but what is important is responsiveness. And we need to respond to labor markets, to innovations. Secondly, while it's important to talk about quality assurance, it has to be agile if we're talking micro-credentials. Came out big as well is digital identity and how it links to micro-credentials. Subtopics of that or sub-conversations around that was digital divide, sorry, particularly in the SADC region, registry, records and certifications, data privacy, and rights of learners, and the need to build these kinds of data infrastructures, and the importance of building systems that are interoperable. I think it came out strong as well in the last session was collaborating beyond the education sector and how do you involve industry in this sector, but also cross-border collaborations. Building trust, public trust was something that came out quite strongly in all the interventions, and equity and inclusion also came out quite strongly. Now, in terms of building the framework, one big advice that came out is don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of work around the world around frameworks and principles around micro-credentials or implementation of micro-credentials. That context is critical, that we need to define micro-credentials. We need to develop common language to facilitate better understanding. We really need to clearly identify what is the potential of micro-credentials and why we have them. I think it came out as well, as somebody raised it in this question and answer session. The principles for this framework are also quite important, talking about the examples around the principles is quality assurance, transparency, and again, equity and inclusion. Public protection becomes very important. What is the value for learners and fit for purpose? And think about credit transfer from the beginning as we're trying to build this framework. Came out strongly as well is the system of interconnectedness around formal and informal and where these are being offered. And of course, importantly, transparency. So in terms of the way forward, this was the formal regional stakeholder engagement that is part of the work that we're doing in the PoMiSA project. What came out strongly today was the need to engage lifelong learners. What also came out strongly today was engaging industry. So I'm just throwing it back to the PoMiSA people around thinking about whether there is a need for further stakeholder engagements. There's also in the development of the regional, regional micro-credentials or guidelines framework that needs to come out of this engagement. and inform and support SADC in developing their official regional guidelines. So this unit, whatever comes out of this, will support the SADC office when they work on their on what would support the region. There will also have to be a link between what comes out of this and this framework with what countries are developing, because obviously we are talking about the interconnectedness, the cross-border collaboration. So that would be very important as we also think about our individual countries. We are looking at what came out of these regional engagements. And the last thing that came out that James was trying to avoid was financing. And I think that's also something that when we talk about this, it would need to come into place. Thank you very much. I did keep to my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for an excellent summary, even though you were only given 5 minutes, but you really pulled all the strands together very nicely and given us our homework for the future. Now it's for me to ask Dr. Sylvia Damas, who is the CEO of the Namibian CHE, as well as on the executive of the Southern African Quality Assurance Network, to do the vote of thanks and the closure. Sylvia, are you? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zawada, and good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, Olivier. I appreciate this opportunity to propose the vote of thanks at a very exciting discussions on the intricacies of microcredentials in our respective regions. First of all, I sincerely want to thank the European Union for funding the implementation of the PoMiSA project. We thank the Council on Higher Education of South Africa for conducting the field work, for producing the working papers that form the basis of discussions in this forum, as well as for coordinating and organizing this meeting. We appreciate the work done by Dr. James Kivi and the JET Education Services for coordinating the PoMiSA project, and today James eloquently facilitated the discussions of this forum. To our panel members, we cannot thank you enough for your time and the efforts you have invested in preparing your presentations. Some of you participated in the interviews that preceded this forum, so we appreciate your insights and are encouraged that some of the discoveries and plans that we have under these projects are really aligned with your experiences. So we will use the additional lessons we have learned today in the furtherance of the development of our regional framework. All participants, those who are in person there in Pretoria, as well as those of us in the virtual room, thank you very much for your time and for taking part in the discussions. We will continue relying on you for your input for the successful implementation of our project. We also thank the logistics and the secretarial team for ensuring the smooth running of our meeting and also for recording our deliberations. In conclusion, I wish to encourage everyone to continue engaging in the issues of microcredentials. As we have heard from our presenters, microcredentials have been here and they are here to stay. So we invite you to continue participating in future events of our project as well. At a personal level, as a president of SAQAN, Southern African Quality Assurance Network, I really look forward with excitement the value that this project will bring on the work of SAQAN. So thank you very much, colleagues, for listening and also for your participation. And on this note, I declare our meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you. For the people in the room, lunch is served, but before you rush outside, can we take a photo here, please? And if the panelists can just stay, Yaku, 1 more minute before you can go to bed so that you're on the picture. Thank you. Sylvia, you can also stay with your camera on to be part of this photo. Thank you.
Just come on.
stay as a short first.
Yeah.
Am I short?
Plan B.
Right?
So the one is when I have options.
You want to stand here, take out that one.
Can you do a selfie? Selfie time.
I'll take you.
Yeah, there we go.
That Collins bombed your photo.
Wendy.
I was tall. Cheese.
Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to the panel. You are released now. Thank you very, very much. Good night,
you.
Jaco, and
Thank
have
you.
a nice
you.
day,
Bye.
the rest of
Good
you.
night.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Good
Thank
afternoon.
you. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye, colleagues. Thank you.